we got a good military and we can take down governments. And he said, I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. He said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Welcome to the Daily Wrap-Up, a concise show dedicated to bringing you the most relevant independent news as we see it from the last 24 hours. Sunday, March 1st, 2020. Thank you for joining me today. I've got a very special, jam-packed, focused show for you today, entirely about the coronavirus. Now, I had a hell of a lot earmarked for today that I might actually be jumping on for another stream after this, but I'm not promising, depending on how much time I have left, but it will be coming your way. As I said, the one I was going to do about Pompeo and his press conference, the more I look into that, or excuse me, rather the hearing, there's so much in there. I'm going to show you another clip from that today about the coronavirus, but as well as Syria and some other things that I will be getting to. But today is going to be very focused on what seems to be the most consuming topic going on today, but simultaneously what I would argue is easily one of the most important things happening right now. Not because of what they're telling you, but because of what they're not telling you. Because of all of the information around this topic that's being actively kept from your view and censored, manipulated, including, as you know, one of my videos that is still right now censored for discussing the very things that we're openly discussing right now on YouTube. Because that makes sense. But we're going to talk today about the misinformation around this topic, the hype around the topic, the fear-mongering going on, the downplaying as well, the conspiracies from all different sides, the currency plot in regard to the globalization agenda, New World Order discussion, even the 5G concerns, discussions of people getting sick and potentially the entire thing being about 5G. You know, that topic that I discussed on day one that has suddenly resurfaced online, but we're going to get into that again because there is some more information, new information around the 5G discussion. And all of these things, every single one of them will have somebody somewhere online right now, including official figures, telling you that they know for sure that's what's happening. And I argue that none of them do. And in fact, most of these things have facts and information that seem very logical and rooted in evidence and data and facts that we're uncovering. But each one of them also have parts of the story that don't seem to add up. So today is going to be a thought experiment in everything that we're looking at, including why possibly it might be all of these things somehow combined to some degree, causing what we're looking at. The one thing I can tell you I know for sure, based on what I'm looking at, but nonetheless I still want you to come to your own conclusions and do your own research, is that the story they're giving us is simply not true. There's far, far more going on here than what we're being given. So let's go through a lot today. Hopefully, those that have been watching this show, or rather, more so the ones that haven't, maybe you're new to the show, hopefully you will go back and look through some of our previous videos that we really go in depth on each one of these things we're about to go through, with the exception of 5G, which we'll go into more today. But there's a lot of videos that I go through in depth about the history of U.S. government biowarfare and their experimentation on humans, including American citizens in foreign countries. A lot of deep research on the past. But today, we're going to go through each one of these, the overview, and, in depth pretty well on a good amount of them. But as I said, completely on the coronavirus. So let's start with a couple of things that I'm seeing today and, tidbits coming out yesterday into today that really kind of, show you where we're at and why this doesn't seem normal. Everything about this thing seems unnatural, seems incongruent with what we think we know about viruses, what we think we know about how they interact with the human body, what we think we know about how the human body is supposed to react after the fact. I mean, every single one of these things, it doesn't line up. Some people having all of the symptoms but not having a fever, people having dry cough yet somehow being labeled with pneumonia. These things don't make sense, including a hell of a lot more. And some of the things we're going to talk about to start line up with that. The idea that somehow, and I hear it's far more than 14% people that are coming down with whatever they're calling this thing, coronavirus or whatever you want to believe it is, have somehow come around to being tested positive and then reinfected. Which, I'm not a scientist. I'm sure things like this are possible, but the reality of this is so prevalent right now does not make sense. As we understand it in most cases, this is why vaccines are supposed to work, because you create antibodies after your body fights off the disease or a virus, and then you're able to fight it. This is why vaccines have, why they're rooted in logic in a sense. Of course, what that's not taking into account the intentions behind it, which is why I argue vaccines are something you should avoid today, because the intentions are not there. The safety is not there. I do argue that scientifically you could make something that would be plausible and logical and effective. But today I'm not seeing that. But the point is that we're looking at people that are coming around and being infected again, and that doesn't make sense. Okay, we have same thing, reappearing weeks later in discharged patients. I mean, this is happening all over the place. We have coronavirus cases of unknown origin. First one reported, of course, was in Iran, which was very suspicious. And now we have the second apparent unknown origin, which doesn't make sense, of course. When one or two to have these cases pop up, the idea would be to say, okay, well, it's unknown because we can't trace out how it got there. There may be an explanation, but to have one and then two and then three and then one in Iran in the middle of the country that we can't understand how it got there. It begins to look like these things are being placed as opposed to just organically finding their way, especially with the argument that this started in China, right? This doesn't really add up, and it continues to happen. Oregon official claims third coronavirus case of unknown origin. This is beginning to be not an exception to the rule, but rather a common occurrence where we're having Oregon and California and Iran and all these unknown origin cases. That is abnormal. Here's a case of 4 cruise ship passengers. This was on the 29th. Rushed to Los Angeles with an unknown illness, which doesn't really, I mean, it has all the same, the discussion of this story has all the same markers as everything else, but somehow they're being labeled as an unknown illness. Everything about this doesn't add up. And these are just a few of the little markers that we could go through. And I can make a whole show about the things that don't add up with what we think we understand. And that's always passed off as, mutations or evolving this or that, or, whatever they want to throw at you. And of course, never the fact, that they're in a dark room somewhere toying and tweaking with these things to make them super viruses to be able to use them. But that's neither here nor there, according to them. But these things don't make sense. And that's why people are rightly asking questions today. What's going on? Is this a bioweapon? Is this some kind of other electronic manipulation that we're not being told about, and the virus is simply the cover story? Are these weapons being used against other countries? Is it a complete lie? Is it not there at all? Are, these fake pandemics, are the numbers being overhyped or not being told enough? All over the place, everywhere. So let's start with that discussion in regard to the fake pandemic. Here's from Global Research, COVID-19, coronavirus, which interestingly enough was the exact same name they used, even though it's a new name for a new thing, when they were doing the Event 201 experiment 6 weeks before this happened. I'll let you spin that around in your mind. Because I guess they just decided to use the same one they used in the experiment 6 weeks before this happened. That's just coincidence, though. They'll tell you. A fake pandemic. Who's behind it? Global economic, social, and geopolitical destabilization. Now, as it says, about 84,000 people in at least 56 countries have been infected, and 2,900 have died, according to the New York Times. Now, what they fail to mention is that 98% of these cases of infected are in mainland China. That's just the infected. There are less than 5,000 total confirmed cases outside of China, and this was as of today. This is that statement was as of the 28th. This article's as of today. But this was from the World Health Organization. Now, it says at the moment, there's no real pandemic outside of mainland China. Now, you could quibble about the definition of the word pandemic. I argue that it's not what they're trying to describe it as. But if you want to get nitpicky about the term pandemic, as I understand it, it simply means that it's happening in more than 2 countries, to the extent that it's everywhere in the world. Arguably, it's clearly in more than 2 countries, but then there are others that argue that there's a certain level of effective, cases in these countries that then would make it that pandemic. And this is why the World Health Organization has pulled it back and said, no, it's not a pandemic, despite clearly being politically pushed to do so. And they said that, and then 2 days later pulled it back, because that's not suspicious at all. Now, at the time of the writing, it says the number of confirmed cases in the U.S. was 64. Now, understand, by the way, again, that all of these cases are coming from government information, from people that have lied about information about exactly cases like this before. MERS, SARS, HIV, Ebola, across the board. They've been caught lying about these things to a litany of reasons. whether it's to make it look worse than it is or downplay it because they don't want you to know. It's all over the map. But the point is they have and they do. So these numbers are always meant to be taken with a pound of salt coming from the government. So it could be 0 cases in the U.S. for all we know. But just to understand that going forward. Then from them, the number of confirmed cases in the U.S. is 64. As they say, a low number, and the media is spreading panic. Now, there are those that argue, well, if this is the time to spread, not spread panic, but rather just spread, concern and tell people to be worried because we stop it now before it gets bad. But the argument is what they're doing is, for instance, when the World Health Organization comes out and argues that it's a foregone conclusion that this is going to spread all the way around the world, even if that's a fact, and understand that saying that without the context is the point. It's incredibly fear-mongering. That's what the whole point is. Because as I'm going to show you a video in a moment, the argument is that, yes, it probably will go all the way around the world. But still, that's not a reason to fear because it's not as dangerous as they're making it out to be. The flu goes all the way around the world as well. And we don't wake up every day in fear, right? This is the point. It's about the context. But the fact that the World Health Organization comes out and says this, that it's not a matter of if, a matter of when, it's a matter if, but when, it's going to go around the world, this makes everybody flip out because CNN and Fox News are telling you all this is possibly a world-ending global pandemic, and then they come out and say that it's a guarantee. I wonder why stores are being emptied out. I wonder if that benefits in particular ways, the economy. I mean, there's a lot of things that this is driving, but they are absolutely spreading panic unnecessarily. Now, of course, there are people out there that are going to hate that just because that aligns with what Trump is saying about them. But pull yourself out of this two-party manipulation. Stop looking at what one side is saying to the other and just look at the evidence and the facts and recognize that regardless of what party is saying what, because it achieves their momentary goals, sometimes they say what's correct just because it does align with their goals. And yes, right now I agree, they are spreading panic. Now, meanwhile, there are 15 million cases of influenza in the United States. 15 million. Now, as we go through a lot of these points before I get through this, stay with us because there's a lot we're going to get into, including the 5G discussion, including a lot of these things, the nuance, the way that they're going to be using this potentially, but it's important to understand this stuff. That we have 15 million cases of influenza in the United States. 15 million. Millions of deaths around the world. And this is something that we have to consider when you're balancing this. Now, there was a clear campaign coming out saying, stop comparing this to the flu. Why would you not compare it to something that's obviously relevant? We can argue the semantic, the differences. One has a higher or lower death rate. The R naught rate. People say RO incorrectly. It's the R naught rate, which is how it spreads, how quickly, and the how many times it spreads to people from one person kind of idea. The idea is that this is a very good analogy between the two. Now, apparently 64 cases in the United States. That's what they're claiming. That's not death. That's confirmed cases. Now, this is the latest surveillance from the U.S. Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. The CDC, the same group that's been caught lying about any number of things like this more times than I can count, whether it's vaccines or numbers or, just the simple fact that they stand to profit wildly from the sale of vaccines. That shouldn't play a factor. But the CDC reports that as of January 18th, there have been 15 million cases of flu, 140,000 hospitalizations, and 8,200 deaths. I mean, that's as of January 18th in the United States. Let that sink in, right? Talk about pandemics. I mean, why would we not be more concerned about this when it's obvious that there's more deaths? I mean, the argument would be again that this, give it 6 months, maybe the coronavirus will be far worse. But that's not the point. Where we're not dealing with hypotheticals. We're talking about the death rate as it is and how it's spreading. And this is you can see that they're blowing this out of proportion as it stands. Now, there's certain levels of concern and precaution are obviously necessary. But there's times when the same mainstream media will downplay concerns because act like other people like the independent media are fear-mongering when in fact all we're trying to do is bring you the truth. Whereas now we have them trying to fear-monger around things that are not as serious as they're making it out to be. They're always the liars in this case. Now, as data on this, it says the World Health Organization on the 28th this year said that 83,652 confirmed cases of COVID-19, of which 78,961 are in China. It's quite a bit. Outside of China, there are 4,691 cases, according to Again, World Health Organization. Understand that we already found out their tests aren't working properly, that they were testing with just simply scans of the chest for pneumonia. I mean, all these different things. These numbers are not, at best, not definitive, in my opinion. Now, the World Health Organization has also reported 2,791 deaths, of which only 67 have occurred outside of China. 67. They confirm that the pandemic is, of course, largely limited to China. Now, why? I mean, this would be obviously an incredibly relevant point, but this is actively being omitted from mainstream coverage. Now, moreover, it says recent data suggests that the epidemic in China is firmly under control, which, again, unless China is absolutely lying, which is completely possible, and again, with the World Health Organization agreeing that China is correct, and they could also be lying. But that being said, it seems pretty clear that China is on the decline, that their numbers are going down. The increased cases per day are going down. Right? There are cases, but it's continuing to decline, showing you that what they're doing to some degree is effective. Now, China's National Health Commission reported that 36.157 patients were designated as cured, or excuse me, I think it probably meant to be a comma, and discharged from hospitals. Now, the reports confirm that people have received treatment and are recovering from the virus infection, which is, by the way, a vast proportion of the people that get infected. Right? I mean, that should be another thing that you think you would hear regularly, that is most people don't even come close to dying. So don't be so concerned. Not happening. Now it says the population of the world, 7.8 billion. 7.8 billion people. The population of China, 1.4. The world population minus China, 6.4. Now 4,691 cases, 67 deaths. That's outside of China. Out of a population of 6.4 billion. And yes, I know the argument is that people are actively doing things to slow it down and it's spreading. Nonetheless, this is still based on the actual rate of death and the numbers that we have. That does not constitute a pandemic, right? That's 0.0000073%. 64 cases in the U.S., which is a population of 330 million, is not a pandemic. I mean, we have states right now declaring emergencies, shutting down borders. Now, obviously, this is playing a huge factor on, racism in and of itself, but just general sentiment towards China. Now, this is very important to understand because we're going to get into a lot more about the economic side effects and whether or not this was a deliberate attack on China, even if we're not talking about a bioweapon. Simply choosing to take charge of the moment, never letting a crisis go to waste and using this to attack China's economy because we can clearly see this benefit for the United States. Now, this is a deliberate campaign against China was launched. A wave of racist sentiment against ethnic Chinese is ongoing, largely led by the Western media. Now, understand, again, this is where the whole bat soup sentiment came from, right? We know that's not true now. That's been clearly shown. And yet still to this point, we have the media perpetuating that lie because that is used to make it seem like their weird, disgusting culture is what caused it all, right? That's what this is. It's the same sentiment. I mean, the moment you can make it about their weird cultural differences, that's when you can discuss it. Oh, well, the bird flu and the swine flu and all the things they're dealing with is because they're just gross, right? That's what they're trying to sell people, and usually aimed at the lowest common denominator, the people that already have kind of racist sentiments and just don't like anybody different. That's what they're going to do. And they're going to look at them and say, gross. They're different and they're gross. That's what the problem is. And think about that when you understand that, the swine flu and the bird flu and all these things are also shown to be bioweapons that were manufactured and intentionally released, just like we're talking about now, at least in my opinion. But this is not just my opinion. All these past cases have been discussed by people like Dr. Boyle, thousands of virologists and scientists around the world on multiple continents, all agreeing that this is absolutely what we're staring at. So it'd be easy to be like, well, they're just different and gross, right? That just explains it all. It's kind of as simple as just saying, well, all those bad guys are just maniacs just like to use chemical weapons. You don't need to make sense of it, right? Always how these things go. Now it says the U.S. strategies consist in using COVID-19 to isolate China. Again, this is whether or not it's a bioweapon, right? You could argue that it was used in that sense, made and used that way, or just that they're using it now after the fact, whether or not it was a bioweapon. despite the fact that the U.S. economy is heavily dependent upon Chinese imports. Now, it says the short-term disruption of Chinese economy is largely attributable to the closing down of the channels and trade of transportation, which you can clearly see has been an obvious immediate effect. Now, it says the White House is considering freezing all flights from the U.S. and China. Now, remember, this happened when the World Health Organization basically argued not to shut these things down in the beginning, and the White House did it anyway. And you can argue that a lot of these moves from the United States have caused a lot of the kind of spreading panic. Despite what Trump would say, the actions of the government itself, the U.S. government, have been clear. Now, it's spearheaded by media disinformation. There's another dimension, panic in the stock markets. The coronavirus fear has triggered the drop in the financial markets worldwide, right? And this is where I play the back and forth about, okay, so it's clear that there are some effects happening on the United States government and the people therein, but understand if they were aware this was going to happen, insiders wouldn't be affected. Sort of the same way that most of the insiders really actually made money in 2008, as opposed to losing it like the people that didn't know what was happening, right? Seeing as how they all knew it was coming, they all shorted everything and did, whatever they claim, and they made a bunch of money, right? We've all seen it, right? This is the history. You can see how this would play the same way. Oh, well, this is going to affect the stock market because we depend on China for a lot of things and the world economy in general. So we're going to make a lot of money in the case. Nonetheless, you can see that it is affecting the United States to some degree. Now it gets into the idea of Event 201 and the history of this and how it's clear that this was planned in the sense that this could happen, right? But every single moment, every single part of Event 201, which was basically an organized exercise for coronavirus, an outbreak, how they would deal with it, martial law, right down to everything that we're dealing with, including using the same name, which I think is absolutely laugh out loud ridiculous. So you're telling me that in this exercise, 6 weeks before this happened, they used nCoV 2019. They used COVID-19 as well. This is 6 weeks before it happened. I guess they just chose to use the same terms. That makes sense. There's far too much going on here that should make you concerned. And then we get into the concept of the World Health Organization, which is involved from that moment on and well before. That the people involved in this have a long history of lying, covering up epidemics. I mean, look, this is the New York Times covering this. This is back, obviously they wouldn't cover this right in the moment because they know that they can't bite the hand that feeds them. They do it when they're allowed to. But as you can see right here, it says, it's worth recalling that the World Health Organization scammed during the mandate of his predecessor, Dr. Margaret Chan, who stated in relation to the H1N1 swine flu pandemic that, quote, vaccine makers could produce 4.9 billion pandemic flu shots per year in the best case scenario. And this is in regard to the fact that it's in regard to the profit around this topic. And there's a lot to be made. A lot. Now, there's another article before I move on that I want to get into in global research as well. Now, this is in regard to, was it a bioweapon? Is it man-made? And we've talked about this a lot. Now, what the Western media fails to address is that there is a probability that the virus could have been made man-made in one or more of the numerous U.S. biowarfare laboratories. Now, again, I urge you to go into the previous videos if you're more interested in this, because it's very clear, the history of actively doing this. The U.S. government has admitted over 290 times to have used bioweapons, chemical weapons on Americans to test them for no other reason than to test them for their own information. That's a fact. It's been admitted to. So the fact that they're ignoring the obvious probability here. I mean, all of these, the 4 different studies, I think 5 studies now that show that there's been manipulations here. And each one of those are manipulations that are rare. Incredibly rare. So every single time we're talking about them leaning in the direction of a smaller percentage to just say, well, it's probably a mutation versus the very high percentage of that being a man-made manipulation. And every time leaning towards the smaller percentage. Why? Because they're not supposed to discuss the fact that they're actively working on bioweapons all around the world. So the probability is far more logical that it's a bioweapon, but that's not being discussed outside of certain circles. Now, Western media also silent about the fact that the virus appears to be largely affecting ethnic Chinese, meaning it targets specifically Chinese DNA. That can't be ignored. Almost all of the deaths and confirmed cases of the 51 countries and territories to which the virus has spread so far are of Chinese origin. It appears to be strengthening, at least reportedly, as it mutates over time, is the argument, making its control even more difficult if that's actually happening. So will it eventually, break the Chinese DNA boundaries if it is in fact mutating and affect other DNA types such as, Caucasian people? If this is what we're staring at, that's certainly something that's possible to consider. Now, the COVID-19 infection rate seems to have been gradually declining in the last 3 weeks, if these numbers are to be taken at face value, and it does seem to be the case. And there's no doubt that China will overcome the epidemic if this is the case. It seems pretty clear their actions have been working for them, regardless of how you agree. Because again, as I've said in the past, I don't think what they did in regard to the complete martial law lockdown, including the quarantine, there's arguments to be made for why that is indeed sort of archaic. The fact that you can, bunching all these people in closed quarters doesn't seem like the smartest idea. And there are actual leading minds today arguing that quarantine in and of itself is some kind of an archaic idea. That's why it's interesting to see this debate between Iran, but that's another story. But it seems that they will be overcoming it. Now, the world needs to wake up to the fact that this could be an act of biological warfare. The fact that is something that absolutely has to be openly discussed. Even if we're discussing the fact that it could have been from somebody else other than the U.S., the fact that it's being so closely shut down by the media, by even members of the U.S. government, it seems pretty clear that that's something that sensitive topic. Why would we not want to talk about that? People like Boyle would argue it's because, well, they're all working on this stuff and they don't want to shine a light on it. They don't want everyone to find out, well, we're all working on bioweapons actively right now. That makes sense. Now, in the last 2 years, since 2018 alone, China was hit by several types of bird flu, H7N4, H7N9, in 2018, and yet another strain, just in January. This was 2020. All right, that's what's so weird. All this stuff was popping up right at the same time, which was actually just overshadowed by the COVID-19. But it's weird, especially knowing that these in and of themselves have been accused of being the same exact things. Now, there was also an outbreak of the African swine flu, 2018, killing millions of pigs. And there was a massive food crop destruction, which I find especially relevant, mostly corn and soybeans, by their so-called army worms, is what the term was. But I find that very interesting, especially considering, the Insect Allies program that hundreds of scientists spoke out and said, yeah, that's actually not a defensive weapon. That's the DARPA program to attack foreign countries with their insects. Consider what we're seeing today with the locusts and everything else going on, and this is something you have to consider. 2019, what do you know, right? This article's from 2018, right? So 2019, a year later, less than a year later, and suddenly we have army worms destroying Chinese crops. This is very real stuff that we're not allowed to talk about. Now, compensating for the impacts on the supply of pork, corn, and soybeans, China resorted to importing these commodities, and most of the imports came from the United States. Interesting, right? Now, again, that's just one data point, but as always, ask yourself who benefits. Now, were these outbreaks, which had destructive impacts on Chinese economy, obviously, were they coincidental? They've created instability, food price inflation, and a dependence on imported agricultural products from the United States. But clearly they didn't have enough effect because China's economy was still thriving, still surpassing the U.S. Now, the Western media has been playing up the so-called Trump tariff war, as we've all been seeing with China, while hidden from the limelight and in parallel, more serious warfare, specifically biowarfare, has been going on all around us. Now, there are just too many coincidences, of course, to conclude that the arguably strengthening coronavirus, or if that is what it is, and I'll get into some more discussions in a moment, considerably stronger than SARS, the one of the 2002-2003 epidemic. Escaped a Wuhan lab by accident, or as the West would like to present it, by negligence. Well, China just didn't do enough, seeing as how it's also relevant to mention that, the World Health Organization, the CDC, the United States government, and numerous other people such as Harvard were actively working in that very lab, but, whatever, it's only their fault. Even within that narrative, there's so many things that make that not make sense. Now, first, in regard to, coincidences. And we've talked about these all before, again, in depth. There were the military Olympics in October in Wuhan from the 18th to the 27th of October. If you remember, as we reported at the time, where right before all this started, there were 200 American soldiers who participated. And of course, you know that the first cases of 2019 coronavirus were discovered about 2 weeks later. And remember, 2 to 3 weeks is the average gestation period from infection to outbreak. But, just another coincidence, I'm sure. But we know that this leads into Event 201 that happened right after that. Event 201, this was October 18th, or rather in the midst, I would argue, at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security in Baltimore, Maryland. Spiro did a great video on this. We've talked about this many times. And this, of course, was sponsored by none other than the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the World Economic Forum, right? That's, the corporatocracy representing big weapons, big pharma, big money, and of course the John Hopkins Institute themselves. Now, the theme was simulating a high-level pandemic exercise, for those that may not have seen the coverage so far. And the simulation produced 65 million deaths, the simulation. And this was just a couple weeks before the first COVID-19 victims were identified. Now, the sponsors of Event 201 now apparently say, quote, "We're not now predicting that the coronavirus," again, please recognize that was used the same name 6 weeks before this happened in the simulation. I think that is laugh out loud ridiculous. But they were saying, "We're not now predicting that the coronavirus outbreak will kill 65 million people. Although our tabletop exercise included a mock novel coronavirus, the inputs we used for modeling the potential impact of that fictional virus are not similar to the one you're dealing with now." They just used the same name, but that's what they're talking about. Weird. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, really. I mean, one doesn't have to be a rocket scientist to conclude that the simulation and the outbreak right afterward and everything else we're talking about was it's at the very least is obviously a ridiculous coincidence. But I don't think any of us think that's what it was. But third, in a long list of probably about 100 coincidences that we could list off, the timing, of course. And this gets into the idea of the economic problems, right? The timing was very clear, hitting China right on their most important holiday, the Lunar New Year, when people are traveling, uniting with family and friends, when there are usually huge festivals with lots of people. An event, it's usually celebrating happiness, a massive event. And this was all cut short by the outbreak that put Wuhan and portions of the Hubei province and a total of about 50 million people, Chinese, in quarantine. And more, no shopping, no exchange of presents, no celebrations, a massive, almost uncalculable economic loss. Now, is this a sinister plan carried out by a Western elite? Is it, to specifically attack China's rapidly growing economy that's clearly outpacing the United States? I mean, would that not be a huge agenda for the country that right now has been continuing to say that China and its economic growth are their number one concern? Is it an attack on the yuan, which is also gradually replacing the dollar as the world reserve currency? I mean, when that happens, the U.S. empire, which essentially relies on the dollar, is lost. So the argue would be clearly that they would be willing to take just about any action to be able to stop that. Now, in late January, the World Health Organization's Director General said that the new coronavirus, again, COVID-19, was not a pandemic. On January 30th, probably on instructions from Washington, he declared the outbreak of a global emergency. Interesting. But added on his own initiative that there were no reasons for countries to ban the travel of their citizens to China, which I mentioned a moment ago. In contradiction to their recommendation, Washington then immediately issued a travel warning anyway for U.S. citizens not to travel to China. Many other countries followed their leader, their master's orders or suggestion, especially the Europeans. Now, another hit on the Chinese economy, clearly. in every possible way. Cruise ships with Chinese on board are not granted docking rights. Merchandise vessels are in many countries not allowed to enter international harbors to unload their goods. I mean, every single step of this is astronomically affecting the economic growth and benefits of the Chinese government. Now, on February 28th, 2019, Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization, said that, quote, more than 20 vaccines are in development globally, and several therapeutics are in clinical trials. This is more than an insinuation that massive government-directed and possibly forced, as we've always been warning, vaccination programs will be implemented, especially with all the panic surrounding the whole thing, right? If we get enough people worked up, I don't see any resistance to saying, well, we need to force everybody to do this to save the planet, right? That's why the level of fear needs to be so high. In other words, the health predicament, misery, and scare imposed on people will translate into a multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar bonanza for the pharma industry. Do you think that might play a factor on their decision-making process? Deciding, maybe we can be a little more scaremongering with this, knowing that we'll make maybe billion more dollars? Maybe. And people innocently will go along with it, people that don't know any better. I mean, maybe they'll be forced to at gunpoint. Ultimately, who knows? Now, let's look at this in perspective worldwide. As of today, 87,000 infections were reported. That's at least the last figures. The vast majority of them from China. The total death rate is somewhere about 3,000. This corresponds to an infection to death rate of about 3.4 in total, which is pretty low. Far from a pandemic. Again, I know people hate this, but compare it to the Spanish flu from 1980 to 1920. About 50 million people died, corresponding to a death rate of about 20%. So far, the worst pandemic in the history of humanity. Now, another factor, hardly taken into account by the Western media, is the recovery rate of COVID-19, which you'd think this would be obviously a point to discuss. Now, of the 87,000 infected, 42,500, almost half of them, fully recovered and were released from the hospital quite quickly. Now, from the 42,500, the recovery in China alone was 36,000 and rapidly increasing as we speak. Now, China is increasingly on top of the disease and estimates that at the latest by beginning to mid-April is in full control of COVID-19. Again, according to the data coming out and backed up by other institutions, which could definitely be fake. But it doesn't seem to be the case. Now, again, there's no COVID-19 pandemic if this is what we're looking at. Doesn't mean it can't change. But there is, of course, a panic-making pandemic rushing around the globe right now. An artificially media-imposed panic, of course, paid for by Big Pharma and Big Finance, that will move, again, huge amounts of accumulated capital from the common people to the top, as is always the case. To the upper echelon, the billionaire elite, right? This is exactly the kind of thing that we're always talking about. Now, again, whether or not this was the plan to be from the beginning, just a happy coincidence within that plan, or just simply something they capitalized on after the organic virus took its toll, we can see this happening. Now, Washington also realizes that the East, Russia, China, Iran, and the rest of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is something you should look up if you're not familiar. It's something that stands to rival the West's control, the West's organizations. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is no longer dependent on the West, but could carry on with an autonomous Eastern economy, which in and of itself would be an incentive for other countries in defiance of the U.S. to join, which seems to be quite a lot today, right? The entire dependence on the dollar is what gives Washington its economic control over even its allies. Levying sanctions against people for doing totally normal things because it doesn't benefit Washington over everybody else. Gee, I wonder why people would try to get away from that. Right? The China, Russia, Iran alliance is one of the strongest Eastern Axis alliances here we're talking about, which also provides full energy self-sufficiency to the Eastern countries. Again, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, the association of the SCO and the Eurasian Economic Union, the EEU, apparently comprises today about half of the world's population and controls about a third of the world's economic output. Clearly, this is a big threat to the United States government, who has actively been talking about, writing about, organizing about how to maintain the dwindling maintain U.S. preeminence, the dwindling economic and military control. Or I guess I wouldn't call it dwindling military control, but rather it's the fact that the overt military venturism is compensating for the lack of their control in other places, which is absolutely dwindling right this moment due to things just like this. I mean, staring at this in the face, looking at China and Russia and Iran clearly comprising the biggest threat economically, not terrorism, not actions of any other kind other than rivaling their control economically, not doing anything illegal. Gee, I wonder how far they would go to stop that. Maybe that's why Iran and China are by far the worst affected in what we're staring at. Just a thought. Clearly something we should be considering. Here's another interesting thing to watch in regard to this topic. So I've checked these numbers and these are accurate. SARS 2004, avian flu 2008, swine flu 2010, MERS 2012, Ebola 2014, Zika 2016, another Ebola 2018, Corona 2020. What's the common denominator? All election years. Oops. Now, I mean, of course, this could just be another of the many, many coincidences we're staring at in the face, or it could be just exactly what you might think it is. All of these, by the way, are cases and weapons that have arguably have been released and used intentionally, as many, many, many people, including Dr. Francis Boyle, the person who literally drafted the U.S. Biological Warfare Act, openly saying that these are all bioweapons, man-made, intentionally released. All of them. Which would make sense why they were perfectly timed along with elections and used against other countries and perfectly isolated against very specific parts of the population. Recognize that every single Ebola outbreak that's ever happened in Africa, or at least, in living memory, has been within a very close proximity to a U.S. level 4 bio lab in Africa. Let that sink in. Easy to verify. I guess that's just coincidence. Now, this is where a lot of people are beginning to get to. Regardless of the nuance and the different discussions and the arguments, at the end of the day, regardless of what it is and how it's being used, that we have to recognize, as usual, the cures will be worse than the disease. Historically speaking, this is absolutely what we're dealing with. A great article by James Corbett. I really recommend you read through this because I'm just going to skim over the bullet points, but this is a fantastic article, as always. And the point he's getting at, look, there's so much going on around this. Is it spreading? Is it mutating? It's going viral. Is it natural? It's man-made. Is it a flu? It's worse. It's less. It's all over the place. Everybody knows what's going on, when in reality, none of them do. And that's why I'm hoping you guys out there will show some discernment, because everybody, and a lot of them probably have convinced themselves they know the secret, but a lot of them out there are just trying to tell you, they're picking up on something like the 5G discussion, they're jumping on, they're making a whole thing about it and selling you on why they're certain, and then of course including that they have some source somewhere that tells them they're right, and then everybody will sell this as the absolute fact. False certainty is deadly today. Absolutely deadly. And I certainly think that 5G played a factor in this based on the evidence that I've seen, and I'll get into that next, but the point is that we don't know for sure. We don't know that it's one thing alone. It could be a lot of things. So it's dangerous for people to act like they know for sure when they really don't. And it's even more dangerous for other people to share that information as if that's absolutely the facts. We need to be skeptical, people, more than ever. Now, the point is that the argument from a lot of people is that this is being used, whether it's after the fact or created to do so, to create certain things that have always been in the works. Things that you'll be familiar with if you're someone that's followed this channel or Corbett's channel or any number of channels that have been trying to tell you the truth for a long time. That they'll use this to do things such as create unprecedented surveillance and control of the population. All right? Now recognize, again, even if this is a real virus, even if it wasn't created, even if, whether it was not a bioweapon or was a bioweapon, or it organically happened, or they put it out and they did, it was a virus they had on stock and they just let it release out because they hated the Chinese people and the Iranian people. It doesn't matter how. The point is they're using and this is why they're pushing the pandemic, pushing the fear, because they'll use that to get you worked up, to get you emotional, get you feared of everything around you, and then use it to push unprecedented surveillance and control of everybody around you. Why? Well, because we have to stop this virus, because we all agree that it's going to end the world, right? That is what they need to, that's what they will always do. Always. Now understand that you don't need to do all of these things, because it's pretty clear that their unprecedented surveillance is obviously not producing anything. I actually wish that I had an article that I've been kind of putting on the back burner for a while now. I'm not going to try to find it out right now, but the argument, and it's not even an argument, the studies, the information has shown us very clearly that their surveillance of us has done absolutely nothing other than give them a stockpile of information on Americans to use when they choose. It hasn't been able to stop really anything, hasn't been able to really, to prevent anything really. And this isn't just my opinion. This has been historically shown. And so why do they want it then? They want it because they're watching you. That's what it's always been about. It's always been about creating justifications to create the surveillance network that they've always... this is why they lied to us about it over and over and over. Is the NSA spying on you? Clapper says no, but we know they were. He lied because they don't want you knowing about it. And control of the population is a huge part of this. Now, Corbett's talked about, and again, I hope you'll read through this, about social credit scores, Sesame credit, how China's using these things now. And again, this isn't just the United States government. He's talking about a worldwide entity here in some cases. But the social credit scores, using your actions against you. And of course, these are all things that will lead toward control for your safety, right? Always for your safety. And he says the first thing to note is the sheer scale of what the Chinese government's attempting here. The quarantine imposed in Wuhan last month encompassing a city of 11 million people. That's unprecedented. Was already the largest quarantine in human history. But when that quarantine expanded to include the entire province, population of 57 million people, the scope of the lockdown became nearly unimaginable. How can such a quarantine possibly be maintained? I argue it can't. It's simply ridiculous, especially when you're arguing that suddenly we're having cases of transmission back to animals. The argument is that, people are saying that their dogs are being affected. Suddenly, then you have the worries of, street dogs in the street, and there's no way you can control, talk about herding cats, right? This is exactly what it becomes. There's no way. And this is why people like Iran are saying that this is archaic. This is not something that's feasible today. But of course, because they're using anything they can to make Iran look like they don't know what they're doing, well, then they're going to attack them for it. I'm not saying that I'm not sold one or the other, but there is a clear argument for why it does make sense. It's archaic. He says, well, as we've all seen, it can be done by good old-fashioned brute force. When in doubt, just weld the sick person's door shut and they can't leave their room, right? This is what we're talking about. Drones flying, right? Drones flying to watch you and tell you what to do. A nationwide surveillance system. Right? Color-coded rating on your smartphone, a payment app to identify people as low or high risk. Everything's monitored. Everything. And all they need is for you to be scared enough, just scared enough to allow them to implement all these things so that, for your safety, of course. But then, of course, those things, suddenly the threat goes away, but guess what? The implementations don't. Interesting how that always works, right? Ask how that temporary Patriot Act is doing for you, Number two, a blank check for Big Pharma and the World Health Organization, right? All these people that stand to profit wildly. And of course, all of the congressmen and other U.S. politicians who are on the boards or have seats waiting for them on the boards or have stock in these all these different things are also stand to wildly profit. And these play a factor on their decisions. They have to. This argument that they're just altruistic and they'd never allow their finances to play, that's ridiculous. Humans are humans and they will make decisions that benefit themselves. They'll rationalize into making it okay. This is what people do. And that's just ignoring the obvious, nefarious, sinister aspects of people that do this regardless, which very clearly plays a huge role in our governments and all governments for that matter. But this is what's happening, a blank check. Even if it's real, understand. Even if it's real, they're going to hype this up to be able to make more money, to be able to spend more money, to use it for any number of projects, including vaccines that are untested. They're going to use to test on people. And then, of course, the vaccine court will pay for any problems that come, which comes out of your paycheck and not from the companies that make it, which obviously creates a system of where they don't need to really test things because why? We don't have to pay for it if it causes a problem, right? That's very clear. But as he says, always ask, who benefits? Que bono. Who benefits? Right now, we're staring pretty clearly at some culprits, but it always plays a factor. The person who stands to benefit from a crime is probably the person who committed it. That's always something to consider. Probably, not always, but probably. He says, during the swine flu non-crisis, and again, it's important to reflect on these things. Swine flu, the Ebola non-crisis, the Zika non-crisis, these were all things that were hyped up just like now. Arguably, we can see a lot more going on. Right? I'm still not sold on whether everything we're seeing is legitimate, but we see a lot of things, a lot of trucks spraying and people in masks and videos all over of people falling over and lots of things that could easily be manipulated. So that's clearly a big difference. We saw a lot of this during the other non-events, but then it wasn't the same. Clearly, this one has pulled out all the stops. But we know during swine flu, Ebola, Zika, we were lied to. They got caught lying to us, hyping things that weren't there, passing off flu cases as whatever they wanted. Every single time. I don't know why this doesn't play a factor now. But during these non-events, the World Health Organization was led by Director General Margaret Chan, which is the one we just mentioned. It was under Chan's watch, remember, that the World Health Organization declared the 2009 swine flu an outbreak of a global pandemic, which, by the way, we now see clearly that it was not. But remember how much they hyped it at the time. Remember all the videos and the articles and the pictures and all the everything. Everyone's, banning different flights and different things being locked down. It was very similar to what we're dealing with now, including the fear. Now it says that they declared that one a global pandemic, a move that automatically triggered billions of dollars of vaccine purchases by various governments. Again, I don't think that's always the only thing going on, but how is that not an obvious motive? This was a blatant cash grab, of course, and even the Council of Europe was compelled to note that the members of the World Health Organization, the council that made the pandemic declaration, were also sitting on the boards of the vaccine manufacturers who stood to benefit from that decision. That is happening right now. Right this moment, understand. This is not new. It's happening right now as well. Happened before that. Okay, has to play a factor. And only when Corbett writes about it years later do people actually go, oh, we got to think about this now while it's happening. Now, the next one, it says number 3, an excuse to implement medical martial law. Now, we're already leaning this way. We are already leaning into the vaccination discussion about why we need to force them and why we need to, children especially is where it's starting, but it's going to get more. We see people calling for this all the time. Forcing people to get vaccinated. It's like even just people like Bill Nye having discussions about why. There's so many off the rail discussions. In a country that supposedly covets freedom, right? Personal freedom, self-determination, right? And in a medical system that's supposed to be based on informed consent. We're at a point now where they're saying, we know what's best, shut up, and we're going to make you do it because it's best for everybody, right? Because they've never been wrong before, right? That's never happened. They never sold us into something that turned out to be a problem. They've never just simply had nefarious intentions, right? All these things are documented in history. It's crazy that we're being told right now that we shouldn't be asking questions. There's never, ever a time when you should be forced to do anything to your own body. That's crazy. That is next level authoritarianism, and that's where we're going. And of course, if you make enough people fearful, if you make enough fear and enough people scared for things they don't understand, well, then they'll be willing to do anything, including implementing medical martial law, which has been a plan for a long time. Whether that's for profits or just to continue whatever other agenda that's pumping through those vaccine shots, they're going to continue it by force, by the barrel of a gun. Now, understand, as he says here, that the U.S. specifically, in this legislation took the form of the Model State Emergency Health Power Act, a piece of legislation that was drafted by the CDC of all people, because that's not alarming at all. Of course, the very people who stand to make money from the process are making bills for Congress who are then passing them for the CDC. Please tell me that's not completely alarming, right? The revolving door of our BS system. Now, it says the act grants government the power to quarantine, force vaccinate, and mobilize the military to help implement emergency procedures as deemed necessary to contain the outbreak. That's right now. You understand? We're one step away from them saying, well, it's an emergency. I'm declaring an emergency nationwide. Now we're going to use this act. It's already there. We're going to force everybody to get vaccinated. And if you don't, you're going to go to jail. right? Talk about, love that freedom discussion about our country, right? No, it doesn't exist when they say you're in danger. The very country that's lied to you about things like the doom of false flag, or the entire war of Afghanistan, or ongoing manipulations in Venezuela, the fake coup in Bolivia. The lies upon lies upon lies. But this is the group that's going to stand up and say, well, we know things you don't. It's an emergency, and we're going to force you to take things that we know are dangerous, but we're going to profit our own people because blah, blah, blah. That's crazy alarming. But we're one step from that right now. Number 4, an excuse to crack down on the internet, right? These are all things that have always been going on, and now this virus has created a one-stop shop for cracking down on all the same things simultaneously, and anybody out claims, oh, this is about censorship, oh, this is about the election, they're gonna say, you're crazy, it's the virus, and you're causing fear, you're making people die, right? That's what it's gonna be. Suddenly, nothing is arguable. No argument is valid. We're so fearful of the world coming to an end that censorship doesn't matter. Free speech doesn't matter. Freedom of the press doesn't matter. All of it's getting shut down. Meanwhile, Assange is getting put to death. No one's paying attention because we're all so afraid of this virus. They will use these things, again, regardless of whether or not this was created or it's being used. This is happening as we speak. Now, remember, Zero Hedge had their Twitter account shut down for talking about these about the same time as when I had that video removed, about the same general topic. Neither one has been rectified. Still there. Number 5, precipitating economic crisis. Now, this is important, and this is what we were talking about a moment ago, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. The idea that this is creating the perfect storm to use this and levy this against China specifically in regard to their economic rise, as well as ultimately sort of creating, or rather covering up, an ongoing economic crisis in the world. And, in the US and a lot of different places. Right? So now suddenly the economic crisis becomes, well, it's nobody's fault, the virus, right? We couldn't stop it. Think about that. That's an interesting discussion. He says, given that I make my living online, the prospect of internet shutdowns and censorship crackdowns are worrying to me. But before you become too distraught over the plight of the poor podcaster, let's put this crisis into perspective. Assuming that the virus goes to pandemic, it is quite likely that this will be the largest economic disruption of our lifetime. This is the point where I would put forward some facts to back up such a bold statement, but given that we just saw the worst week in the market since the financial crisis, including the worst 2-day point drop in the Dow Jones, I doubt that's really necessary to elaborate. Right? This will have these effects, and I argue to a certain degree it's covering them. Interesting to think about. But the bottom line is, he says, coronavirus pandemic is a giant boost for the globalist agenda. Absolutely it is, in every possible way. From removing dollars, physical dollars, because they're dangerous, and using, we're going to start using digital currency now to save any kind of concerns for the future, right? Or even, every possible globalization bullet point is being bolstered with all of this, which we'll get into more in a second with the video from Spiro. But before I get into that, a great article from the Organic Prepper. Here's why I don't really trust the official American coronavirus numbers. Now, this is crazy to me, and this gets into the topic of sort of the idea about blaming other countries for not being able to effectively manage this problem. Iran specifically, which I'm going to get to at the end today. But any number of countries, China was the first one. Literally, while we have evidence through the roof that the U.S. government, as well as some other ones, are either wildly unprepared and not doing anything they're supposed to, and not testing properly, not, safety procedures out the window, or for some reason know that they don't have to, right? Think about that. Like, maybe that this is all not really what we're looking at. Maybe there's a reason they're not really testing because they're not really concerned. That's just a theory. Bottom line is, we see a lot of evidence that the U.S. government is not doing what they're supposed to. We just talked about the whistleblower who came out and said, look, these safety precautions are not being met. People are being let go and coming in. They're not testing. This is out of control. And that just gets covered up. Meanwhile, they're saying, look at Iran. They don't know what they're doing and people are in danger. And we're clearly, at the very least, have examples of the same exact thing. It's interesting. But as she says, here's why I really don't trust the official numbers. She says, hardly anyone is being tested in the United States. First of all, very few tests have actually been performed in the United States. Now understand, this has been discussed by and large over the last so many days. As of February 26th, the CDC reported that only 466 tests have been performed in the US. Only 466? I mean, think about how crazy that is. There are more cases, arguably. That's pretty alarming. And the criteria for being tested is so narrow as to render the statistics useless. Think about how many flights were coming back from China in the week this was happening. I'd argue probably a hell of a lot more than 466. Now, while they're trying to argue that Iran's lying about their numbers without having anything to base that on, we are probably completely unaware of how many people are actually suffering from this within our own country. And this was proven to be the case when the patient in California who was finally tested after 4 days and found to have the coronavirus, even though she has not been to China or knowingly been in contact with anyone from China. Why wasn't she tested sooner? Right? Because she didn't fit the criteria laid out by the CDC. Now, this is an important point because they had this criteria of when and how to test somebody. And this is being widely criticized because there is a lot of different nuance to this and parts where they are choosing not to test somebody when there's an obvious concern, which you could argue they know what they're doing and they know how to test it. But I disagree with that. But at the same time, you can't spend the whole time saying this is the most dangerous thing ever and it's going to spread the world and we should all be concerned, and then just kind of say, well, we're not sure, but we're not going to test because it doesn't feed our criteria, right? There's any number of reasons why they could have crossed paths with people or they could have been on the wrong flight, and they just say, well, it doesn't fit the things that we wrote down, so let him go. And that has been happening, which is this California person is an example of that. And she says, what about all those people being monitored, right? Well, hold on. I was going to read I forgot there's one other part in here. She says, she says, because it didn't fit the criteria, says hospital administrators said they immediately requested diagnostic tests from the Centers for Disease Control Prevention, but the procedure was not carried out. So understand that they requested tests, the doctors, right? Or rather the health hospital administrators. And they didn't carry the test, but it was not carried out because the case did not qualify under strict federal criteria. She had not traveled to China and had not been in contact with anyone to be infected, right? But so she's showing the symptoms, right? All the markers, everything that seems like coronavirus, according to what they say. The doctors themselves asked for tests and they said, nope, we don't want to because she hasn't been to China, hasn't been in contact with anyone infected. They let her go. She wanders around. Turns out she does have it. So the test says. So they chose to let her go. Think about any number of people, according to the R naught number, that's like 2 to 3 people that she could have affected, and every one of those people will possibly infect 3 people. Now, it's already out. It's gone. There's no that is gone after that. That's the point. So the argument is either it's not what they're saying it is, it's not as serious as they're saying it is, or we're already completely screwed and no one's telling us. Right? These are the two things we're talking about. I argue it's kind of neither. Now it says, so this delay is testing was not the fault of the physicians caring for her, but the CDC. Now, why would they do that? Like the very group, their entire job is to keep you safe from possible threats. And they're just being kind of, well, these are the arbitrary things we wrote down, so we're not going to apply it, even though this person's showing the symptoms and the doctors think they have it. It just doesn't line up unless they know something we don't. Says it sounds familiar. It's because in China, only certain patients were given tests, while thousands of others were turned away. Now, it says in Hawaii, the state thought to be an extremely high risk for the outbreak. Doctors now must get approval from the state investigator to test patients or even put them under monitoring. It's odd, very odd. It says, so 466 people have been tested with potential flaws, right? The tests are flawed, as they ultimately said. Countless people have been untested simply because they haven't traveled to certain countries. Odd. Now, in comparison, New York Magazine reported that more than 7,000 coronavirus tests have been conducted in the UK. Right? South Korea has tested more than 30,000 people in drive-through testing facilities. And the province of Ontario, Canada has tested 629 people. All of these places have far lower populations than the U.S. So what's going on? Right? Why in the world would they not be doing this? It's either that they're wildly incompetent, not prepared, or they know something we don't. This is given these facts, do you really think that only 60 people are infected? Right? So she's arguing that it's probably a lot more. I'd argue that it's not what we think it is. Now, the argument she has about the monitored people is, look, all these people that they tell us are being monitored, they're not sure. These are all people that don't fit that criteria. People that they claim are not in the criteria, but arguably potentially have it, but are just being monitored. That means they're being released back into the world, walking around the United States. Think about that. Now it says, and now Vice President Pence has issued a gag order. A gag order. If the obfuscation above isn't bad enough, now all statements from health officials must be cleared by this is not a free society. This is not how a free society operates. This is the unofficial COVID-19 czar, right? Before this is, of course, when the Washington said, "Well, we're not going to declare a czar. It's fake news." Then the next day it declares a czar, right? It's just stupid, always ridiculous. But the point is that this is information martial law. Like, you are shutting down the flow of information in the midst of a crisis. I mean, arguably in the midst of a crisis which necessitates the fastest flow of information possible. And yet now they have to go through even more steps just to get the information out. Now, what happens when the information comes to Mike Pence and it's information that doesn't bode well for the U.S. government, that doesn't bode well for what they want the world to see, but it's very dangerous for the American people? What do you think they're going to do? Probably not talk about it, even though it's dangerous for you. Sort of like the way they've done it many, many times before, testing on you, lying to you about things that put your life in danger over and over and over. Now, there's a gag on all information because, of course, they're looking out for your best interest, right? Because that's how that makes sense. Ridiculous. It says this goes right along with the Ebola crisis management playbook. And this is the same idea that we know they've played this before. It's the same old rigmarole, the same old lies about past things they've lied about numerous times. Now, I hope you'll read more through this. It's a great article. But the one for me is that the tests, the fact that they're not being very thorough, right? And while they're calling out other countries for similar things, and it's very clear that, again, either they're not really being thorough or that they know something we don't, and there's a reason they don't really have to be as concerned. Interesting thing to consider. Now, this next video, great. It's by Dr. John Bergman. And I want to play you just one quick part of this, but it's a great video. Again, 13 minutes. I hope you watch the whole thing. It's entitled, "I am not afraid of the coronavirus," in 10 minutes, I think, or that's what he says. But the point is that he goes over why it's not what we think it is, and the fact that you're being manipulated, as always. But there's a couple parts that I wanted to play here for you that, again, I thought were very interesting, kind of disjointed from other things, but nonetheless relevant and important for you to hear. Let me know the volume in the chat.
So what's really going on? There is a world economic crisis that the governments are going to take advantage. And this is hugely important. That economic crisis, if you look at South America, you look at Africa, you look at Greece, you look at Europe, okay, this is economic crisis is spreading. Why? Because the World Health, the World Bank, okay, is going to these countries, loaning money, getting involved in their infrastructure, and then if they can't pay it back. Okay, just like the housing crisis in America in 2008. So we're seeing a world financial crisis because dollars, the currency, is no longer backed by anything tangible. So if the governments of the world came clean and said, look, we screwed up, okay, we don't have any value-backed currency, we're going to have to change the entire structure. If they blame a virus for causing an economic collapse, then cool, they're safe. World governments have to control their populations for the worldwide depression. Absolutely. So if we blame the economic crisis on a virus, then the governments are set. Plus, when we look at our population, 54% of America's children have a chronic illness or disease. 60% of...
Now, really, listen to these statistics. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that these are relevant because we're talking about medical discussions, but really let this sink in just in a general sense of well-being. These numbers blew my mind, and I would argue that, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm surprised, but still I wouldn't have guessed they were as high as that and I did look into these, and they are absolutely correct. But listen to what he just said.
The economic crisis on a virus, then the governments are set. Plus, when we look at our population, 54% of America's children have a chronic illness or disease.
54% of children have a chronic illness or disease. I mean, how? I mean, that's outrageous. I mean, this is from a country they're trying to act like we're the leading country in wealth, health, and medicine and welfare. I mean, there's a problem there, right? Why is that not being discussed? More than half of our children have some kind of a problem. I mean, guys, there's a problem here, and it's not just this virus. I mean, that's just something that we have to consider.
60% of our adults have a chronic illness or disease. 70%.
So 54% of children, 60% of adults have a chronic disease or illness.
Percent of our adults have a chronic illness or disease. 70% of our 17 to 24-year-olds don't qualify for military because of some type of mental, emotional, or physical challenge.
Again, let that sink in. 74% of children between, whatever you said, I think it was 18 and 24, 74%, they cannot join the military. I argue that's probably irrelevant when they need people, but because they have some kind of an issue, mental, physical. I don't know about you, but that just makes me sick.
70%. That means America is sick. Literally, 70% of Americans cannot qualify for military service. Now, we know that this is actually going to be plunging a lot of companies into despair. Why? Because we have about 3 months worth of parts for cars, for assembly of electronics. And once that supply dwindles, then people in our assembly factories are going to be out of work. So there's a huge amount of problems with production. There is a purpose to it. Now
that's an interesting thing to consider before we go forward on that. These are things that would come from China and other places being affected by this, right? So arguing that there's only 3 months or that it's a certain period where until those run out. The point is that there will be, if this doesn't change, a catastrophic effect on more than just China. Which is the point. He's arguing that this is meant to cover up some massive economic collapse to change. But see, this is the larger argument to change that and use it as the driving force to move into the one world government, one world currency idea. Now, I know some people think this is outrageous. This is just total conspiracy theory. But there's a lot of data behind this. And we're watching this thing play out right now, and it's something to consider at the very least, as all of these things are. As always, I'm not telling you I know any of this for sure, simply bringing you the information to come to your own conclusions.
Huge amount of problems with production. There is a purpose to it. Now, the media, which in our country is completely controlled, when we look at what are we hearing about? Are we hearing about the health crisis? Are we hearing about the crisis of our kids? Are we hearing about why in 2025, the cost of autism will exceed our defense budget? That's 5 more years.
Please tell me you heard that. By 2025, the cost on this country for maintaining autism and dealing with people that have autism and the obviously outrageously growing number that's obviously coming from vaccines and manipulations will outcost our defense budget. I mean, that's just, I can't even wrap my mind around that. And this is the point. This has been growing astronomically. It went from a huge difference to all of a sudden like 1 in every 4 kids. There's probably more than that. I haven't checked in a while. There's obviously something we're doing to ourselves, and the profit is too much that the people in charge don't care. But sure, we're willing to spend more. That's because it's a $1 billion industry now, and that's too much to get rid of.
Will exceed our defense budget. That in 2025, the cost of autism will exceed our defense budget. That's 5 more years. If this kind of stuff was in the news, people would be picking up their pitchforks. What's in the news, and go to the site, ourworldindata.org.
So you can see the points he's making here. Terrorism is overrepresented in the media by almost a factor of 4,000. Right, that's the big red graph to the right. Right, so which means it's discussed about 4,000 times more than it's actually happening. Homicides, same thing, overrepresented by a factor of 31. But then you get to the other side of it, and there's things like kidney disease, heart disease, drug overdose, that are far, far more effective, or rather far more influential and have more effect on the people, that are actually discussed 11 times less than they actually happen, 10 times less than they actually happen. How does that happen unless there's an entity trying to drive you to think certain things and ignore others?
Terrorism, homicide, suicide are in the news. Except terrorism, you're talking that's overrepresented by a 4,000-fold. What they're not talking about is heart disease, cancer, diabetes. Okay, these just are footnotes, but they're talking about diseases from around the world. Why? Because of...
Right. So they're talking about all the things that they can make lots of money on, right? But all the diseases, or rather ignore the diseases, the vaccines, while ignoring all the things that are affecting us right now due to those vaccines, due to the medicines, due to the horrible food we're fed, all the, everything you could discuss, all the foreign things, the glyphosate, the fluoride, the, everything, BPA, all this stuff that are actively hurting us that we know are hurting us, GMOs, all the studies are there. Right? All this stuff is causing diabetes and causing all of these problems, and that's why they don't talk about them. Please recognize that. And then, of course, that's why they talk about terrorism 4,000 times more, because they need you to think that's what's most important. Be afraid. All of our warmongering and overthrowing countries is because terrorism, even though it's not as real as they make it.
If we were looking at what's actually happening to our population, we'd be looking for the environmental cause. We'd be looking for the toxicity, deficiency, or the causative factors, not just being victims. Let's look at cholera. It kills about the same number of people in percent.
Now, the argument it makes here is just simply that, let me turn the volume back down real quick, that cholera, it's the same idea as the flu. And this, I know, again, this is the thing that people really don't like, because it's, stop comparing it to the flu. I don't know why they keep saying that, but I find that kind of humorous. Like, stop making that obviously relevant comparison. But cholera, obviously, is, killed a lot more, infects a lot more, higher death rate, and this is just something that it happens all the time, right? It affects 3.5 million people and causes almost 130,000 deaths. All the time. This is a regular occurrence, but this isn't a pandemic. People aren't freaking out about this. Anyway, now the point I want you to leave on that last point he made, right? That and this is something John Rappaport has been really honing in on lately, or rather just in general, right? And this is almost always what these things are a cover, right? That they're selling you something, anything. And usually a virus is a good sell to cover up things that they're creating. Catastrophic effects on the environment that their industry is creating, whether it's the pollution in the air in China causing the problems in your stomach or, in your lungs, which I don't think that's what it is, but that's just one of the environmental discussions, something that they're doing, right? They're not going to stop producing all the things that they want to make money for, so they don't care if it's pumping all the crap in the air, and that could be directly causing, at least partially, some of the problems. But what are they going to do? Are they going to just stop all of their big profitable industries? No, they're going to make up a reason to say, well, it's not us, it's that thing nobody can control. So just chalk it up to that. In the meantime, we're going to sell you vaccines and make more money that have nothing to do with the thing you're suffering from, but more money and more money. And then when the vaccine hurts you, we'll give you something else, and more money on top of more money. But one of those environmental discussions could, of course, be 5G, something that's not a virus, something that was not part of the natural environment, but something that was placed there that could potentially be causing these problems. And I know this is something that people are very interested in. Now, before I actually get to that, I wanted to play one more thing in regard to the potential, I guess, globalization discussion. The idea that this is some kind of a plan. And 5G is definitely an inclusion in that. That's why I wanted to drop that in there. Then we're going to talk about 5G next. But this is one of those topics that people kind of laugh off, in the respectable circles, like the New World Order. Oh, you guys are crazy. Oh, you're Freemason discussions. Oh, you're such conspiracy theorists, right? Conspiracy theories, like, any number of things that have turned out to be true, like NSA spying on Americans, or fluoride in your water, or geoengineering, or, oh, you're all crazy conspiracy theorists until they turn out to be true. My favorite one is the black helicopters, right? Which is very obviously something that they actively use. I can show you 11 articles about it right now, and yet people will still be like, oh, you black helicopter conspiracy theorists. It's like, yeah, you mean those things they use all the time in war? Yeah. It's crazy that people still go there. But this idea that there is some kind of a global effort that goes beyond national borders in regard to a global currency, a digital currency, just control a global one world government. These are real discussions and real projects, whether or not they have mass adoption by the global elites and the unelected power structure or individual government power structures. I do think they do, but whether they do or not, do not misunderstand. This is an absolutely verifiable agenda that is in effect. And another great discussion by Spiro, Coronavirus Endgame, the economic crisis and rollout of the new digital financial system. Now, I just wanted to play a couple of parts from his video here. Again, fantastic video, to just kind of get a quick grasp on what he's saying here. Now, I'm sure most of you probably already know this, but the idea of the global currency and how this is pretty perfectly setting up exactly what, basically creating what they would need to accomplish this without anything else. This coronavirus is pretty much a one-stop shop for achieving all of these multifaceted agendas. All of them. Vaccines, one world currency. I mean, it's kind of this perfectly cohesive thing that's brought it all together. That's pretty damn scary.
Major central banks have been working for years to develop their own digital currencies. They're called CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies. And they're all on board. They're all doing it. I've been researching this on a daily basis for a while now, and you can see it coming. You can see the partnerships taking place. You can see the rollout. Now it's starting to go mainstream. And
I do recommend you check out his work if you're interested in more on this topic, because he has done some great coverage on this.
It's just about ready to roll out. It was only a matter of when and how. And the coronavirus looks like the perfect storm to roll out this new system. Now, if the U.S. economy crashes, the global economy crashes, but it will be a controlled demolition, just like the Twin Towers on 9/11.
Great point. Now, don't forget, remember the discussion that I've had with James Corbett, that I just talked about with him in regard to his work in general, about the engineered collapse of the West. This is something that's been a real discussion that we've talked about in the past, and possibly that people, and this is why we're watching the decline of the U.S. empire and the possible shift into another nation to lead this charge. And this is why we always tell you that these people, the unelected power structure, they don't care what nation they use to achieve these goals. Interesting to consider.
In my opinion, when you see domestic air travel in the U.S. restricted, that will be basically a major domino to fall, which would signal the crash is only days or weeks away. I hope it doesn't come to that, but this is what it's looking like. We have already seen a huge loss on the stock markets. They say it's already the largest and fastest drop on the stock market since 2008 financial crisis. And we've already seen the New York Stock Exchange signaling towards shutting down floor trading because of the virus. They're worried about contamination, and they're encouraging traders to work from home. And on top of that, this is really important here. The New York Stock Exchange is planning to run a disaster recovery drill on the morning of March 7th. So please mark your calendars.
Another dang drill, huh? Gee, I swear, if they do a drill and then 6 weeks later it happens, can we all just agree that this is getting out ridiculous? I mean, it's already ridiculous. But this is what's so frustrating about these discussions, that these drills happen every time, every single time. I mean, on that note, I'll just talk about this real quick since it was the same discussion here. Whitney Webb shared this with me. So this was a tweet put out by Cyber Reason, an article from them. The very group that was behind the simulation of the election that Whitney Webb wrote about, that has ties back to Unit 8200, the Israeli NSA and their Israeli military intelligence. And they, for some reason, were doing a simulation on the shutting down of the U.S. government during the election, martial law and all that. Yeah, remember that? And so this, which is really alarming. Well, now they put out a thing that says, this was removed, by the way. How could coronavirus concerns impact election day? As stocks fall, fake news runs rampant, and masks are sold out across locations. Government officials are considering how to prepare in the event of a coronavirus outbreak near Election Day. That's sure ominous. Oh, and let's go read the article they wrote. Oh, they took it down. I wonder why that would be. They rubbed it from the internet. Maybe they shouldn't have said something, right? I mean, there's a lot of odd things going on here. This group of all people, maybe this is a little too on the nose. But remember this, because if this happens and there's something that needs to be done in the midst of the election because of coronavirus, they always give us these insights. And remember, this is the very group that is tied to all of the other problematic things we're discussing, right? And it's perfect that they would put this out and delete it. There's just too much going on around this topic, people.
For that, it's about a week to run a important here. The New York Stock Exchange is planning to run a disaster recovery drill on the morning of March 7th. So please mark your calendars for that. It's about a week away from right now when I'm recording this. Now, the Financial Stability Board, which operates under the Bank for International Settlements, is currently preparing final drafts for the new financial system. And they're going to be presented to the G20, which is coming up very soon here in the coming, basically, with the Rockefellers and Rothschilds. They're just this current coronavirus crisis will be used to conceal the crimes of the international banksters. Nobody wants to take responsibility for the collapse, so it will be blamed on this outbreak. They will remove cash from circulation, which we are already seeing in China.
Right? Think 2008 times 10. Right? This is exactly what happened. 2008 was one of the largest transfers of wealth in history. And of course, it was all blamed on something nobody saw coming except all the people that saw it coming, right?
This could take some time, but very soon, these central banks are going to roll out their digital currencies, and we will find ourselves in a cashless society. And this is going to be the cherry on top of the international surveillance state, where everything and everybody will be tracked, controlled, monitored, taxed, and regulated into submission. This is the implementation.
By the way, which is also exactly what 5G is meant to roll in, right? The Internet of Things. Everything tied into the Internet everywhere, including, very soon, your own body.
Period that we see rolling out, and it's all connected to the United Nations, the central banks, the climate change agenda, and I believe the coronavirus. Now, I'll leave a link to my previous report, which is a must-watch. It will...
And I do the same thing. I hope you will take the time to watch this video from Spiro as well as the rest of his videos, because he's done, like I said, he's been doing some really, really great work. I actually reached out to him to see if we could have him on the show to discuss some of this, because a lot of this is leading in a direction that I personally agree with. Again, whether or not it was created or it almost becomes two discussions: bioweapon or not, right? And manipulated or not. And then also whether or not they're using this after the fact or not, or it was made in order to be this. They're two kind of separate things. Either way, it's being used to achieve this agenda. And I think that's hard to ignore. I mean, they never let a good crisis go to waste. I mean, it's always something we should consider. And as this person says in his tweet, coronavirus has done what American economic sanctions could not: shut down non-oil exports, right? So this is talking about Iran, obviously. But think about how interesting it is that we're talking about the thing that they were trying to do, the thing that they've been constantly trying to do in regard to China, stop them from growing, stop them from competing, and of course in regard to Iran in exports and oil and everything else. And guess what the coronavirus did for them? Both of those things. Sure, just a happy coincidence, right? Coronavirus will hammer Iran's economy. Gee, that sure worked out for them, didn't it? There's only so many things that can happen before we begin to start recognizing that there's an obvious lean to what's going on here. And that could be, again, that they just chose to channel it, harness it and use it in their own way. Or this is, I argue, some degree made this happen. I think that's just, at this point, impossible to ignore. Now, obviously, I feel like my opinion is leaning in the direction of a manufactured weapon of some kind. Whether that's bioweapon or not, I do tend to think it seems most likely a bioweapon. But again, all information is potentially influenced and manipulated. So then that brings us to the 5G discussion, which could be kind of the linchpin answer to all of these weird, nuanced stories here. And I'm going to start to kind of make a point here for some people on John Rappaport's article. Now, a lot of people one person in particular is telling them, oh, John Rappaport's lying to you. I say, I want people to understand that I'm not just going to one person's information and then going, got it, I'll bring it to you, right? It's obviously, I hope you know that's not what's happening. I'm spending days at a time, weeks at a time to research things, find the in-depth information, challenge it with somebody else, challenge it with my own thoughts, challenge it with any number of things, and then come to my opinion on it and bring it to you. And one John Rappaport has been historically doing some phenomenal work, right? The guy that literally called it on all kinds of things in the past, whether we're talking about SARS or MERS or HIV or all kinds of things, Ebola, Zika, this guy has been on it. Right, so now we're in a discussion of the epidemic and the so-called epidemic and coronavirus. And of course, in the beginning, his work is based off his previous experience. And it's about the fact that they're probably lying about numbers and that it's not really what it seems. And now that was never him saying, this is what's happening, I know for sure. That was John Rappaport showing you his opinion based on the evidence that's in front of him, based on previous events. And of course, as any good journalist does, when new information comes, he continues to grow. Now, that's what's so frustrating about people who already think they know everything about what's going on and will shout down any discussion that challenges whether, it has to be 5G, it's not a bioweapon, or it's not one or the other, right? So here's John, as of the 28th, discussing exactly what people were arguing he was trying to mislead you away from. Right? It's everyone's a shill when they have the wrong opinion, right? But this clearly, I hope you'll read this whole thing because he's always talked about this, by the way. This was always something that he's mentioned. But I want to get into just a couple quick points here about what he's saying. Now, he says the first issue in regard to the 5G discussion, right? Whether or not that's legitimate, he says, first of all, and by the way, he makes an argument for why it is, but he's asking, this is always good to temper your expectations or your opinion. How much 5G is currently up and running in major Chinese cities, right? That's a very important question onto whether or not this 5G thing is having the effect that we're considering that it is. Because if we're sitting here going, well, 5G does this and does that, and then you dig in and find out, well, actually, there's not very much here or there, it's pretty sparse, or any number of things, that would kind of challenge the narrative, wouldn't it? And he says, and an allied question, how much of China's 5G is in fact operating at the specifically relevant 60 gigahertz frequency band? And I'll show you why that's explicitly relevant, because it would make a big difference if it was not necessarily on 60 gigahertz or whatever that hertz. Now, it says, which appears to be the most harmful health, right? That's a very important thing to think about. Now, he says one very serious claim, and this is where I begin to think that this 5G discussion very much so holds water in a lot of ways. And I've been researching this long before Rappaport's article on the 28th. If you remember, I just not this actual nuance to the discussion, but the 5G part of this and the fact that Wuhan was a 5G hub for the world was one of the first things we discussed on this channel. Like the day this was coming out. So again, recognize that it's always interesting to me when you see these same discussions kind of surge into the media, particularly the independent media. I feel like that comes from somewhere. So that makes me skeptical, right? That could just be that it was organically risen because it's real, or it could be that there's somebody trying to drive this into our view. But just remember that we brought this up a long time ago, as did a lot of other people larger than me. And yet then it didn't really surge. It did now, though. So that's neither here nor there. I'm just saying consider that because that makes a difference. Now it says when 5G employs a frequency band of 60 so it is gigahertz. See, that confused me because I think he wrote it wrong up here. I guess it doesn't matter, but I just hate when I make a mistake. Yeah, see, he just put HGZ. That confused me for a second. I thought I had it right. But so yeah, it's 60 gigahertz. And he says, when 5G employs a frequency band at 60 gigahertz, disruption in oxygen molecules occurs. Now when I first saw this, and I think this was on that big video somebody was passing around, Ashley something, I think. I was not able to find that again today. I lost the link. I'm sure you guys have all seen it. It's all the way on the internet. And there's good information in there. Some things I disagree with. But the fact that oxygen molecule, disruption in oxygen molecules from 5G is one of the most relevant parts of this discussion I have seen yet. And I'll explain why. And this is not even very secret. I mean, I think that I've seen this discussed on, like moderately discussed on some mainstream channels. Now it says, and the crucial ability of hemoglobin, which is in your blood, to pick up oxygen and transport it throughout the body is seriously impaired. So suddenly we're talking about 5G having the ability to impair the flow of oxygen through your body, which, by the way, is absolutely what 5G can do at certain levels. Then you cross this with the idea that, what are we seeing here? We're seeing people collapsing. We're seeing people have coughs. They call dry cough, yet saying pneumonia, except the fact that pneumonia is phlegm, liquid in your lungs. So that doesn't really make sense. But what would make you have a dry cough? Lack of oxygen in your lungs and your blood. Any number of these things add up. They come together when you realize that 5G could be pulling the oxygen out of the air and out of your blood. It would also explain why a lot of people seem to not have fevers, yet simultaneously have all this other symptoms. Right? As she pointed out in that video. When's the last time you saw people with the flu without a fever? Right? This is when I get back to the beginning, is what I said in this very video, that there's a lot of things in regard to this discussion that are just not congruent. It's unnatural. It doesn't line up with what we think we know about how these things work. That's always just passed off as some new thing we're learning about, or it suggests that we're trying to shoehorn in or force in this virus discussion on top of something that's just not that. Now, he says, I've consulted with a trusted source. Now, for most people, and I argue for all of you out there, whenever somebody just says, I have a source, and they said, that should be nothing to you, no matter who it is. That's always the way to go. And that's the same thing I do too. But I'm just going to say, in a general sense, of all people, John Rappaport is somebody who I would trust a little more than others. That's just my personal opinion. For you, it's always, even me, if I say I've got a secret source that says, that should be nothing to you today. It really shouldn't. It really, I should change that and say it should mean about as much as you think you can trust that person. But again, that's always a dangerous path to take. But I do believe personally that John has some pretty fantastic sources in good places. So he's saying, I consulted with a trusted source on this, which again is a good sign of a good journalist, someone that, this is in some ways is challenging what he's been arguing, and he's absolutely willing to consider it and bring it in with his other data. He says, so far, as I continue to look for more evidence, I believe this assessment is too convincing to dismiss. That is a huge endorsement from John Rappaport and what he's been talking about. The lack of open debate among professionals is a sign that the vital issue is being pushed into the background. All in all, given the available literature on 5G, in the face of a stonewalling and the refusal of telecom industry professionals to step forward with honest reports, common sense tells us to look to Wuhan and other major cities, Chinese cities, and their rollout of 5G for understanding the human damage there, which is falsely being labeled the virus is causing it. Now, understand, that's what he's always been saying. Not with 5G, but saying that the argument is something else. So in a sense, again, if it turns out to be 5G, John had it right from the beginning because he wasn't arguing what it was. He was just using the pollution in China kind of as a stand-in, right? Some kind of environmental problem, because the reason he says that is because historically speaking, that's what's happened. There's something that their corporate entities or their government manipulation or their testing or their military agenda is causing some kind of side effect, and they just say, well, it's this new thing where it's a virus. Here's a vaccine, we'll charge you for it, right? And suddenly nothing changes, but we just pretend we're dealing with it. Meanwhile, the corporate interests go on. The military goes on. The same things happen. He says, globally, the ramifications of 5G are immense. Now, he goes on to talk about the repercussions. Now, I hope you'll read this article for yourself. I'm going to get into those in a different article. As this guy says, this is just a random tweet. I just thought this is a good segue into that discussion. As he says, why did so many scientists raise the alarm on 5G? Now, there's a lot of reasons why they did, by the way. Not just what he lists here, but it's a good segue. He says it interferes with oxygen intake, which is true, and I'll show you why, and causes people to fall over. Oh, gee, what do you know? Wuhan was a pilot site for 5G rollout, and this is what was important, as were South Korea, Italy, Diamond Princess. This is the realm of coincidence that is impossible to ignore, in my opinion. Now, this is again from that video. And again, if somebody remembers, if you have that link, please send it to me so I can include it in the show notes. Fixed wireless communications at 60 gigahertz, unique oxygen absorption properties. This is crazy relevant. Now, this is a scientific study. This is a fact. This is not disputed. Okay, and this is being argued as kind of a positive. Thank you for the super chat. We all miss Keith. He's a good man. Thank you for all your super chats, by the way. Sorry, I'm in the zone here. So the fixed wireless communications at 60 gigahertz, unique oxygen absorption properties. Now, I'm not going to go through all the, that's not the right, we're not legally, but, just the scientific jargon in here. But the point is this. Okay, so we're already dealing with a lot of different signals here, but right up before you get to 50 gigahertz is where it like immediately jumps from 0 to immediately 98% of energy absorbed from O2 by 60 gigahertz. That's crazy. So and understand that 60 gigahertz is where we're talking about here with 5G. Okay? So the point is that if this were turned on to a certain degree with enough stations all in a specifically close area with a lot of human beings, how is this not going to affect the oxygen intake into their blood? Which is what people are arguing is happening right now. I mean, this is something at the very least that needs to be addressed. This is something that people in official positions need to argue, because this is basic level. Obviously something that we would be like, okay, wait a minute, this is very dangerous. Not only just not, I mean, and specifically and this is what she talks about in the video as well, that we're talking about a frequency that was agreed upon. Right? The reason this was agreed upon was arguably because of the effects that it has. Also, remember of where this stuff came from. Now, we're going to get into that. The argument of 5G in and of itself, it comes from a lot of nefarious places. The frequency itself is almost the same as crowd control technology, and this is ultimately where it stems from. And this is something that has to be relevant to us today. Now, before I move past this, I just don't want that to be lost on anybody. The reality of this, the fact that we're talking about a frequency that literally pulls oxygen out of the air. And we're talking about people suffering from symptoms that could easily be explained by lack of oxygen in your blood, including explaining the different nuances that don't add up with the discussion of a virus. Again, such as no fever, such as a dry cough when you're supposed to have pneumonia, such as falling over in the middle of the street. All of these different things perfectly line up with everything we're talking about here. I don't think that can be ignored. Now, global research, again, as I've told you in the past, this is a fantastic outlet. Just the trove of information that goes back decades. I hope you'll take the time to dive through. Same with my site, by the way, The Last American Vagabond. This is it's become basically the daily wrap-up site lately, but you go back 10 years, there's some really powerful work on there from all types of outlets, from any number of topics. So I hope you'll take the time to dive through that. But 5G. Now, this is a topic that we've talked about numerous times on this channel. Again, I referenced Derek Bros for those of you that really want to understand what this is. Like, this guy is in a eternal battle right now with the 5G purveyors in Houston. You know, Derek Bros is probably the one person I would argue you should go to first to understand why this is so dangerous. Now, the article is saying the 5G danger can't be overstated. Now, this is exactly what we're dealing with right now, and this is all the stuff that's out there and we know, and yet the government does not care. Now, that either means that they're so incompetent and so negligent, such malfeasance that they're willing to risk your lives for profit, or there's more of a nefarious agenda there, if that's even possibly more nefarious, to create something to be able to be used against you, if need be. Now, number one, it says 5G danger, hijacking your sweat duct antennae. Now, just the first one to read. Tell me this doesn't just send chills down your spine. Like the fact that this is what is going to be. Now, again, actually, before I get into that, understand what 5G, the bottom line is that 5G is supposed to be more powerful in the sense that, you have faster internet and it's for everybody all the time. Even though they could do that now with the Wi-Fi we have, they could make Wi-Fi for the world if they wanted to. And the reason they don't is because they want to charge you individually for it. But the point is that 5G is stronger, but the wave is shorter. So you can't send it as long a distance. So that means they need a lot more of them. Shorter distances everywhere, which translates to something like billions of these things around the world. And that's their own information. Every so many feet, there's going to have to be another one of these boxes. Those boxes, which then emit the problem that you have to deal with. Now understand that these things are going to be everywhere, all the way around, and that they can be used to affect you. Can be used and turned up to affect you personally, can cause your and we'll get to that in regard to the correlation to the crowd control. But just understand that this is going to be pervasive. It's going to be everywhere. And the argument being that once this is done in the vision that they have, there'll be no escaping this. It'll be nonstop exposure to this and the problems they bring, no matter where you are, every moment of your day, everywhere around the world. That's horrifying. Now, understanding that, let's get into what it will actually do. And this is horrifying stuff. Again, hijacking your sweat duct antennae. Now, the 5G network uses and broadcasts frequencies which affect our sweat ducts. Now, why in the world would that not be a concern? Now, let me look, even if this wasn't the plan, even if there's the people who did it right now and the people who are, spearheading this in the United States have no intentions to use this in a bad way. You're telling me that someone down the line, some Trump-esque person, next spring, whenever, decides to be like, okay, I'm going to use this and turn it up real high so it has this effect on your skin to hurt you, to incapacitate you on a massive scale. These things are everywhere down your street, every however many feet, all the way along, you're everywhere you could walk. And suddenly these things are ramped up and everybody can't move. Everybody is cringing in pain on the ground. Imagine how that could be effective for, martial law, manipulation of people revolting, people changing, deciding we don't like this government anymore. Well, guess what? You don't get to decide. Now, I know that seems crazy to some people, and it should seem crazy because it is crazy. But I hope you're recognizing by today that it's not outside the realm of possibility for the government right now that is willing to fake entire false flag events in Duma to be able to murder Syrians, right? Or to be able to carry out a 20-year war on Afghanistan for nothing but profit and control that killed lots and lots of people. Clearly, something they would be willing to do. Now, it says that it affects your sweat ducts, which acts as an antennae. In other words, our largest organ, the skin, can be influenced and manipulated by 5G. Understand, if they wanted to. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like to leave that to chance. Now, it says, as he reported in this article, scientist Dr. Ben Ishai exposed the connection between 5G and our body's sweat ducts in this video. He says 5G frequencies will zap us with wavelengths that will interact with our geometrical structure of our skin. That's horrifying. We found that sweat ducts work like helical antennas. The sweat duct is an integral part of the mechanism for the absorption of energy, electromagnetic between 75 and 100 gigahertz. So the point is, if they decide to turn it up, it becomes a weapon. Simple as that, right? I'm sure you've seen these things floating around. They're becoming everywhere. So the point is that all they have to do is turn the knob up, and it becomes massive crowd control. He says, and if you change the character of the sweat duct, i.e. made it work, you could actually change the absorption at some point. And if you could do that, you could trace how a person is under stress. Now, we'll get to the point of where it can affect you physically. But then number 2, 5G danger. 5G amplifies EMF damage via VGCCs. Now, wireless radiation and EMF scientist Dr. Martin Paul has done groundbreaking research in explaining exactly how EMFs cause premature aging and injury to the human body, including damage to fertility, brains, hearts, even the DNA. Wasn't that interesting? Right? Tell me that's not relevant to what we're talking about right now. He pioneered research showing how EMFs activate the body's VGCCs, the voltage-gained calcium channels, which causes them to release excess calcium ions into the cell. This then leads to nitric oxide and superoxide, which react nearly instantaneously to form whatever that is, and free radicals. Let's just look it up. It's an ion with the formula that is unstable structure, prepared by, that doesn't make sense. I don't know. So something causes that in your body, and free radicals, which I think we all know. Many studies like this show that damages DNA. So again, that substance damages your DNA. He stated unequivocally that the 5G rollout is absolutely insane. Right? This is a wireless radiation and EMF scientist. Perfect. Exactly the kind of people that they don't care about their opinions. Let's just ask the people that are going to make money off of this. What do you think? Oh, it's totally safe. Good, let's go. Let's move forward. 5G danger, pulsed wave, far more damaging than continuous wave radiation. A significant and unique feature of smart meters is that they emit pulsed wave radiation, not continuous wave radiation. In other words, they run in a start-stop cycles of emitting a burst of EMF, then going temporarily inactive. This happens in incredibly high amounts of times per day. Court documents with testimony from utility companies like PG&E, and that's California, reveal the smart meters send pulse waves about 9,600 and 190,000 times per day. Man. Dr. Paul again states there were 13 studies that show that pulsed wave EMFs are more active and more dangerous than the others, than the ones we're using now, basically. Now it says 5G. Take a look at that before I go back. It says 5G promotes deep EMF penetration. So here's the point. All right, so you've got these EMFs that are coming out this many times a day in massive, stronger pulses, and 5G ultimately helps it penetrate deeper into your body. Lovely, right? Are all these effects worth a lot of, I would argue, moderately faster internet? Like, I can almost promise you it will not be what they think, what they're arguing it will be. I argue some people probably won't even notice the difference, but nonetheless, all these effects will be happening. Right? Consider it like GMOs when they said, oh, GMO is going to save the world. We're going to give food for everybody. Right? How did that work out? They're still forcing GMOs down our throat. But guess what? It's actually caused food scarcity in India, food scarcity in a lot of places. Why are we still using it then? Because it was the agenda and they don't care. We're already so concerned with other things, people aren't paying attention. This will be one of those lies yet again. Number 5, it says 5G is a weapon system disguised as a consumer convenience. Doesn't that make you feel all warm and fuzzy? Mark Steele has been very outspoken against 5G and has now been widely interviewed, including by Project Camelot and also by Sasha Stone in this documentary 5G Apocalypse, the extinction event. Steele claims that although widespread reports state that 5G is operating in the 24 to 100 gigahertz range, it is actually sub-gigahertz. That's weird, meaning that the gigahertz threshold is still measured in megahertz. He says 5G is a weapon system like long-range radar, phased array radar, and directed energy directed energy weapons. He claims that when you examine 5G hardware, it has a dielectric lens, which is proof it is a weapon system. Now that's actually, I cannot believe I forgot about that. So I have a video somewhere that I have to dig up of somebody who actually took down one of these devices in the UK and proved that it was a weapons device. Showed exactly what this guy just said. Took out the lens they're talking about and said that this doesn't exist unless it's a weapon, which is true, by the way. And showed that even the thing that they had was designed to trick you. That it was, they made it look like this part up here that when you dug into it as an electrician, he said, this is nothing. This is fake wires. It's not real. And you dig into the back, it's the weapon system. Really let that sink in. Now, I know that doesn't prove anybody because I'm not showing you this, and I hope you'll question it, but this did happen, and I saw the video myself. The person is arguing that this is a weapon system because of the lens we're talking about, right? And this guy, the video, and I will find that. I have to remember to get that so I can show you in the next video. Proved it. Pulled this down, showed you that this has a lens on the inside. Now, autonomous vehicles, it says, can use 5G to shine in mirrors of other drivers, which is so strong and damaging, it's equivalent to an assault. Mark himself talks about how 5G is powerful enough to kill babies in the womb. It's again, even if it's not what they're going to use it for, the fact that it could be used for that, why in the world would we not be concerned about this? And then it's ominous that they're refusing to address these concerns, which then to me suggests that it's exactly why we're concerned, that that's what they want it for. Horrifying. Now, LA firefighters develop ailments after being too close to towers. This is interesting. In this video, a 25-year veteran firefighter from Los Angeles compares cell towers to cigarettes. He calls for a stop to the cell mobile phone base stations being built on or near fire stations. Firefighters are not the only ones suffering the effects. It was reported that hundreds of birds fell from the sky in the Netherlands during a 5G test. Now, again, please don't forget where we're talking about on this, right? We're talking about what's going on in Wuhan and around the world. This seems, at very least, something that we should be considering. Now, same frequencies as used for crowd control dispersal. Now, this is this is my main talking point on this, and I don't understand why this is not outrageously alarming. Coming from a government that's actively concerned. I mean, right? They made that entire. Do you remember that video the Pentagon put out discussing that the 21st century threat's going to be Americans? It wasn't meant to be released. It was a video for them. And it turns out that the domestic battle is what's going to be the battle of the future, right? Fighting against us. Doesn't that make you feel lovely, But the point is that it coming from a government that is considering you to be their primary threat, why would you be not out just completely concerned that they're using something that could be used on a mass scale every 20 feet around the world to control you? It uses the same millimeter wave frequencies. Called that because the frequencies are so high. Now it says we're talking about frequencies with very, very short wavelength. That's what I was describing. The distances are so tiny they're measured in millimeters, hence the term millimeter wave. Now these are exact same frequencies used by the military for their non-lethal weapons, such as active denial systems for crowd dispersal. The weapons have the capacity to cause tremendous injury. If you're only unlucky enough to be standing there when it hits you, you'll feel like your body is on fire. That's what I was just saying. They can turn it up to the point to where your skin burns, which incapacitates. So imagine, I don't think any government today would pretend like the potential, the possibility to incapacitate your entire populace for whatever reason. I don't think any government would argue that that's not something that they would want to have just in case. Especially today when people are arguing that they want, freedom, self-determination. We want to think for ourselves. How dare you tell us what to do? Well, we're going to put 5G everywhere for you. As well, mutagenic and carcinogenic, right? Causing the DNA damage, causing cancer. Again, the DNA damage. Unbelievably relevant right now. But first, the cancer aspect, we know. This is what we've talked about for a long time. But it says in regard to the DNA damage, which is actually passed down to generations. That's crazy. 5G is mutagenic. These mutations are inherited by the next generation. That's unnerving. This has grave implications for genetic purity. How many people are thinking about this when they can't stop looking at their screens? This website lists studies that they list there, and all these are in the show notes, showing the I'm not sure how to pronounce that, damage, mitochondrial damage that occurs after exposure to EMF radiation. God, it's just horrifying stuff, people. Horrifying. Now, it goes on for a few more. Phased array densification. 5G requires significantly more transmitters, broadcasters, as we talked about, everywhere. Killing the insects. Insects, birds, and children are the most vulnerable to 5G. Now, here is where I come to an issue. Now, again, this is what people trying to sell you on one thing or the other because it's going to get them more clicks and more views and more, and everything will omit things that don't align with the narrative, right? For me, the fact that 5G is supposed to affect the most vulnerable, being children, elderly, right? It doesn't seem to be affecting children. Now, I'm not saying that just automatically discounts this narrative, right? There could be more to this we don't understand. Could be designed that way. Could be, any number of things. But the fact that that's the case, I will get into in a moment, is one problem for me here. As well as the virus, by the way. The fact that children aren't being affected, that doesn't make sense for the virus either. Now, it says it's interesting to note that the last 20 years, we have lost 80% of our insects. I mean, that is something that 80%. I mean, this is why not people argue we are in what's called the Anthropocene. This is the sixth extinction. We're just failing to talk about that. And understand, that's not the same thing as talking about climate change. This is totally different, right? This is something that climate change is wildly politicized. This is talking about actual things that are happening because of what we're doing to this planet, right? Talking about climate change is discussing what we think our actions are causing. And I'm not going to get into that wildly politicized discussion today, but the bottom line is we can all see that what we're doing is having bad effects. We are polluting. We are being very wasteful. We are this throwaway society in which we live. It is affecting things. It's overwhelmingly affecting those around us, the insects, the animals, everything. It says if we get 5G, we're going to lose 100% of our insects, which would be the end of us, by the way. Now, space-based 5G, says 5G's planned to be in an inescapable grid with plans afoot to beam it down from space. But again, this is going to be something that we cannot avoid. At least 5 companies are proposing to provide 5G from space. It's horrifying. Re-radiation inside the body. Way back in 2002, RF researcher Arthur Finstenberg, published an analysis of 5G long before the technology was approved. He explained how due to 5G EM pulses, remember, pulses that come out 190,000 times a day, being extremely short and delivered in bursts, they actually replicate inside your body. They end up creating tiny new 5G antennas internally. My God. By the way, when I mentioned that earlier, this is the idea that we're talking about this actually being implanted as we go forward, but this is talking about creating tiny 5G antennas internally because of these pulses. Probably why that's probably part of the reason. It says when extremely short electromagnetic pulses enter the body, something else happens. The moving charges themselves become tiny antennas that radiate the electromagnetic field and send it in deeper into the body. I mean, how in the world does this sound even remotely safe? And I mean, everything about this is obviously problematic. This is why they're not having discussions about this at all. God, I mean, this is just horrifying. Now, I think I either missed it in here or I had it saved in another article here that I'm going to get to. No, I think I might have just missed it. But here's the point. I'm going to play this for you real quick, this clip that many of you probably have seen. All these things we're talking about, all of these problems, all of these obvious issues that directly affect you, your body, those around you, your loved ones, the viability of our planet. And all of this stuff is not being discussed. In fact, it's not only not being discussed, it's not even being researched. And I'm not just making that up. This is where we are right now. And if you think that's outrageous, if you think that can't be true, explain this.
How much money has the industry committed to supporting additional independent research? And we're talking about research on the biological effects of this new technology.
There are no industry-backed studies to my knowledge right now.
So essentially, the answer to my question, how much money? Zero.
I can certainly follow up with you, Senator. To my knowledge, there's no active studies being backed by industry today.
Anybody else know of industry commitments to back research, fund it, support it, to ascertain scientifically the health effect?
Well, I'm not aware of any.
So there really is no research ongoing. We're kind of flying blind here so far as health and safety is concerned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right? This is our checks and balances, right? I mean, explain for me how that is not headline news. Right? That's something that we have to stumble across and be like, how did I miss that? Like it's crazy. They are not doing their research. They don't care about all these things. And that either means that they know about them and they plan to use them for nefarious purposes, or they don't care about them because they just don't care and they want to make money. Probably both. The bottom line is, as an American, as a member, as a human, as a citizen of the earth, this cannot be okay. We have people leading us into catastrophe because of profit and control. Potentially world-ending problems that they're just ignoring because they just don't care. And yet we're called crazy for daring to ask why we should be listening to these people. How dare you question your government? You're an un-American shill. But then these things, we show you these things where we're just flying blind, apparently. How is that even okay? We have to see where we are right now, and we have to see that we are being gaslighted. People are tricking you. Now, in regard to the 5G discussion, there's a few things that popped into my mind. You know, discussions about, okay, so if this is 5G that's happening, like if this is at least in part 5G that's causing what we're talking about here, and the virus, at least in part, is being used to cover that up. I mean, you could even consider the fact that a real virus was put out in order to cover up the 5G problem, right? I mean, there's all these different ways you could look at this, but the point is that 5G, I thought, okay, well, so how does that make sense that you have it in places, you know, let's say that there are places around the world that right now do also have 5G, but not a problem, at least that we don't hear about, right? They could not be reported, they could be hiding, it could be covered up, there's always something. But you have those, as well as places that have the problem, but you could argue don't necessarily have the 5G, such as Iran. I said, okay, well, Iran, it's an interesting point, right? So why is it possible that this is happening in Iran because it's being focused there? Is it possible this has already been weaponized and it's being pointed at Iran, and that's why we're having it happen there, right? I mean, Israel seems interestingly involved in this. We can see that their aggression towards Iran, interestingly, weirdly popping up in Qom, the one location that's very important, an untraceable location. It's interesting. But in regard to 5G in general, I looked into this a little more and found out, okay, well, Iran apparently finishes their preparations to launch 5G on February 13th. Pretty perfectly timed. Now, you read into this and find out that they are planning to kick off the 5G in late March. So technically hasn't happened yet. But that doesn't mean that it's not running, being used, being tested, right? It's just something to consider for full disclosure, so you have all the information. But I've been seeing people talk about this and saying, I can't find anything on Iran. Well, certainly there seems to be an obvious Iranian focus that's very close to being initiated. I don't think that can be ignored. But nonetheless, there are possible nuances. I've heard somebody point out that there's a location in the U.S. that has 5G, but there's no problem there. But again, that could be because we're just not hearing what's actually happening in the U.S. Remember, this has a low death rate. We could have a bunch of people just thinking they have the flu, being afraid to be quarantined, just not dying and just living through it in their home, right? That's always certainly possible. Or it could just be that there's not enough of them in the location. Maybe they're not broadcasting specifically on 60 gigahertz, as John was asking, right? There is nuance to this discussion. We don't know exactly what the perfect storm is if it is 5G that's causing this, so we don't know then how to judge why it wouldn't be happening, right? So you can see how this gets so outrageously it's off the rails. People have already decided it's 5G, so they know it, and it's already here and there, and then they just don't care about it. They don't care about things that show, that poke holes in the story. They just ignore it and say, if you're talking about that, then you're a shill, and you don't want to, and this, it's dangerous. But I'm hoping you can come to channels like this, and there's many of them besides me, that we're willing to discuss all the possibilities and to counter them and poke holes in them if you can, because that's what honest people would do. Now, this is another article from Scientific American. It says, we have no reason to believe 5G is safe. This is from October of 2019. There's a couple parts, and this is just important to really understand that this is not some conspiracy theory. Even though that conspiracy theory to me pretty much means something we should look more into because it's probably real. But the point is that this is not some fake theory that's being, spread around with nothing to back it up. This is from the Scientific American from October. It says millimeter waves are mostly absorbed within a few millimeters of human skin. This is what we're talking about. Right? So these waves are directly penetrating your skin and can be turned up enough to hurt you, which I already showed. It says, and in the surface layers of the cornea in your eye. That's lovely. Short-term exposure can have adverse psychological effects in the peripheral nervous system, the immune system, and the cardiovascular system. The research suggests that long-term exposure may pose health risks to the skin. Melanoma, cancer, the eyes, ocular cancer, even testicular cancer, even making you sterile. Gee, that seems to align with the idea of depopulation, right? All of these different agendas this is a one-stop shop, it would seem. Now it says, since 5G is the new technology, there is no research on health effects. There is no research on health effects. Let that sink in. This was in October. This was months ago. So again, just like this is what it was. This is where I was going to jump to that video. I just forgot. I didn't want to pass it up. So we are flying blind, to quote the senator. That is really disconcerting. However, we have considerable evidence about the harmful effects of 2G and 3G. Little is known about the exposure to 4G, a 10-year-old technology, because governments have been remiss in funding this research. Think about I wonder why everyone's scheduled. Do you understand in this country, almost every single person will get cancer at some point in their life. Pretty much 1 in 2 people in this country will die of cancer. Really let that sink in. That's not normal, right? We just talked about the fact that 70% of our children between 17 and 24 can't even have some kind of mental psychological problem. I wonder why that would be. We don't care about these technologies. We don't care if to test them because people are profiting, because they're being used by governments and corporations, and we don't care about the individual consequences. You think if they don't care about what this is doing to you and your children in this country, you think they care about what their bombs do to other people? Obviously not. It says, meanwhile, we're seeing increases in certain types of head and neck tumors in tumor registries, which may be at least partially attributable to the proliferation of cell phone radiation. These increases are consistent with results from case control studies of tumor risk in heavy cell phone users. This is verifiably easy to find, and we still don't care. I mean, all the different gigahertz that they've focused on in the past were in agreement for specific reasons, just like what we're doing with 5G right now. Now, why would that be? Now, this again is where I come back to the idea of something that pokes holes in all of these discussions, right? A big coronavirus mystery, again, that no one seems to be talking about. Where are the children? What is going on with the children? Every single time we have a disease, or again, this is where it challenges basic understandings of what we think we know about how these things work. Right this moment, the numbers are pretty absurd. I just showed you this. Okay? 0 to 9 years old, the death rate is apparently 0. Now, obviously, that could be not reported, but it wouldn't be 0 if it wasn't reported. It would be somebody somewhere report a death. We are apparently hearing that there is 0 fatalities for children. Now, obviously, that doesn't make sense because any disease or any virus or any disease you talk about, it will always affect predominantly the people with the lowest immune systems, which are almost always the elderly and the infants. Always. So that doesn't make sense at all, including with the 5G, because if 5G, as we know, also affects children more predominantly than anybody else, these effects you would think would you would see numbers there too. But again, we don't know them enough about why or how this is actually happening. It could be that there's something about the way this specific gigahertz of when it's at 60 affects children versus lower, and who knows. Nonetheless, there's just something that we need to answer before we can definitively claim it's 5G or a bioweapon or anything. But then you recognize that, look, the numbers are incredibly low. So from 59 down, from 59 to 50 is only 1.3 death rate. Then it goes down to 0.4, from 40 to 49. I mean, really, from 10 years old up to 60, you've got like less than 1% chance of dying, which is like, you shouldn't even be worrying about that. You have a higher percent chance of dying from pretty much everything else in your life, right? That's ridiculous. But it doesn't make any sense that it'd be so low and then all of a sudden jump to 8% when you're 70 and then 14% when you're 80, but not have the same effect on 0 to 9. That does not make sense. And any honest virologist, any honest scientist will tell you that. There's something about this that doesn't make sense unless there was something, if we're talking bioweapon, something that was manipulated. I asked this before. I'm not sure if you can tailor a disease or a virus to focus on age. Maybe someone can inform me about that, someone smarter than me. But that would either have to be engineered to do so, right? Or same with the 5G, it would have to be put in that direction. But either way, it does not add up with what we think we know, which clearly does not make sense in regard to the discussion that it's just an organic virus that just happened on its own because of bat soup or whatever nonsensical thing they want to tell you. But where are the children? This is something we need to ask. Because you know that if this was a regular virus, children would be affected. 100%. As somebody says in the chat, children don't use cell phones, right? That's something to consider. But this is a good interview that talks about all this that I hope you'll look into more. But this discussion of 5G is something that can't be ignored. But again, I'm hoping that people will be skeptical, show discernment, look into these things for yourself, and ask the right questions. Because to me, we should be resistant to 5G, obviously, anyway. This is obviously a very problematic thing. And with all of the obvious concerns, this is right up there in my list for what I think is actually going on here. But as I said, bottom line, I think we can see pretty clearly that we're not getting the full truth, that they're actively hiding information from us and actively suppressing discussions about these things. That is always a good indicator that this is probably what's going on. Now, obviously, this discussion is being used on top of all of this to be thrown against countries that they don't like, which is another indication to me that this is being manufactured or at the very least being used after the fact. I tend to think it's the former. Using it, making it happen because they need something to affect Iran. Their sanctions aren't working. They're not attacking their economy enough. They're seeming to get by. So what do they need? Something that's going to stop it completely, which they haven't been able to do. Enter the coronavirus. Now, Reza is saying the Trump administration is trying very hard to portray Iran. I added the very because I think that. To portray Iran as the epicenter of the coronavirus, which, again, if you really think about it, is really ridiculous. Like, really ridiculous. There is no evidence at all to suggest that it started here. At all. But yet, that was very quickly. I mean, they had 4 deaths, and there were already discussions about how they were covering everything up, and it was all happening from Iran. All cases come from Iran, and then, these articles were deleted, and they were hidden. I mean, this is clearly an agenda. They want people to think this. And it's not working, so they're kind of rolling it back, but they're clearly trying to push this, slowly work this in. It looks like they're all doing, Iran and their ideology, and it's clearly could have been the other way around. It's all starting in Iran, and they got it in China, and they've been hiding it the whole time. There is less than nothing to back that up. That's why these articles are getting laughed about, because they're speculation based on nothing but guesses about the fact that they might be hiding something. And then on that, elaborating on what they think they might be hiding. I mean, that is pure speculation from whole cloth. But that's not stopping these accredited journalists from pumping these articles out. But as he's saying, trying very hard to portray Iran as the epicenter of the coronavirus, so that Iran suffers all the economic, political, and international consequences of such a designation. The World Health Organization should stand up to the U.S. government's inhumane politicization of the global crisis. But they won't, because as you know, they're completely part of it. Absolutely 100% part of it. Now, here are the most recent numbers. Which, again, these, I don't know how you can take these at face value. I just really don't. But it's important to see what they're trying to show you, that they want you to see. Now, it's outrageous to see this. And as I understand it, this Iran is the only one that has something like a 15% death rate in general, 54. But that's why I argue that it's because there's something either very oddly nefarious going on with Iran, which, I mean, really recognize that it seems that they were one of the last ones to start having the problem, but just jumped up to having clearly the most. But if you look at the death rate here, it's not that far off from Italy, right? I mean, it's less by far, but it's 41. I mean, you're talking probably, I'm just at a glance, I don't know what, like 8%, But the point is, and I could be wrong there, I'm just guessing, but the point is that Iran has a very high percentage of death to infection or cases. Now, the argument could be that they're missing cases or that they're not reporting them, which is what people try to say. But I don't see any evidence to suggest that. That's pure speculation. So I'm not going to go there. If I find evidence that they're hiding them, I'll report that. I'll report it about anybody. But I mean, just look at the numbers. Why is it that Iran, out of everybody, is getting the focus? I think that has to be clear. And then recognize on top of all of it that Iran and China are the 2 obvious ones that are getting the most severe cases. That says something to me. Now, obviously, regardless of having absolutely no information, everyone everywhere is saying Iran's lying with nothing to back it up. They're lying because we don't like them. BBC claims Iranian government's lying, right? And you read the BBC, they're not saying we think they're lying because of this. The only thing they'll say is because our sources tell us so-and-so. No link to the source, no link, they don't know more information, no name, no, some source in the Iranian government or some source in our government, which is probably not even real. Because how many times have the BBC and the U.S. government been caught saying they have this, or our sources say, and it's wrong all the damn time? That's not journalism, right? You don't get to just quote one anonymous source and argue something that dramatically hurts a government. That's crazy. But they do it all the time, right? When it comes out the other way, it's fake news. But when they say it, backed up by nothing, after they've been caught lying about fake false flags and Duma and any number of things, well, then nobody challenges it. But, of course, the real death toll, they argue, is 210, not 34. Backed up by what, I argue? Reportedly, 210 virus-linked deaths in Iran after canvassing workers at a dozen hospitals around the country. That's it. So the argument is that BBC journalists went there, canvassed. So basically, the BBC journalists, they argue they were there, which that's questionable to begin with, and they walked around. They walked around and looked, and they said, well, it's 210, we're sure. I'm not making this up, people. They canvassed workers at dozens of hospitals, That's what they said. We've learned from our sources, as I said, in hospitals, that the death toll is 210. So really think about how stupid that is. You're talking about BBC journalists who've lied to you about damn near everything you could talk about, whether it's Novichok or Russiagate or every damn thing they've lied to you about. And here they are saying that they were in Iran, they've walked around Iran, they've looked around, they've talked to hospital sources, and somehow come to an exact number of 210. Are you telling me that they went and talked to every single hospital and every single administrator all around Iran, took a tally, wrote the numbers down, added it up, and came to 210? No, that's not what they're saying. They're saying they walked around, they talked to their sources, and talked to some people, and then 210. I mean, it's just laughably ridiculous. I mean, it always is. And this is why it's pretty much always not true. The argument is just to get you worked up. Now, I'm not saying that Iran's not hiding it. I argue that pretty much all of them are to some degree trying to manage the image of what's going on. And that's obviously including the U.S. government, as I showed you before, right? I mean, don't miss that point. The U.S. government right now has at least 2 whistleblowers, I believe, who are saying that they're covering things up. They're hiding information, right? We see 2 examples of them not even testing people, sending people back in from the World Health Organization, the CDC. People screaming, look, they're not doing their jobs. They're covering up the information. And yet, it's only Iran. They're only the ones doing the bad things. Seems pretty overt, if you ask me. Now, as Tritt is saying, your administration brags, and this is the point that I've continually brought up. Now, again, on top of the argument that I think that they're just making up nonsense, let's even just take at face value the claim. Let's just say, for instance, that they are actually having this problem. And they are covering it up because they don't want to get, media negativity, which they know they will get. I argue that's not happening, by the way. But just for an experiment here, sake of conversation, he says your administration brags about strangling the Iranian economy so that it will contract 14% this year, which they have. They'll actively argue and brag. We're killing the economy. Our sanctions are stopping ever out where they can't. This is what they're doing. How is that helping the Iranian people fight corona? Right? That's the point. Their actions are absolutely, in every possible way, completely keeping out medical equipment and medical needs to fight coronavirus. If that's even actually what's happening. Right? So they're not getting the medical equipment that they need. And this is because of U.S. sanctions. Here's the U.S. swinging around and saying, look at them not doing what they're supposed to. Right? I mean, if there were even a single honest journalist in any way, shape, or form around them when they're saying this, or at some kind of press conference, they would say, so you're arguing Iran's not doing enough to fight the coronavirus. How do you argue your sanctions are helping that? You know what I mean? Like, that would be a real journalist question, but they won't ask these things. That is because it's fake resistance. These people are not actually trying to argue. They're just trying to get their career to increase and get gotcha moments within their controlled and allowable discussion. Obviously, even if they're having a problem, that's at least in some part due to the fact that they can't get what they need because U.S. sanctions. If anyone argues otherwise, they're either ridiculously I don't want to be insulting. They're simply wrong, and it's obvious. There's no way to see that that's not the case. Now, you could argue that the sanctions are because of Iranian actions, which is ridiculous, but you could argue that. But that still does not change the fact that those actions are directly hurting the people of Iran, and that's a choice by the U.S. government. And then they're saying, look at how you're hurting these people with coronavirus. You're letting it happen. As he says, your actions are compatible with someone who enjoys and wants this humanitarian crisis, not someone who seeks an end to it. 100%. That's why Pompeo's the one that said, if you want your people to eat, you should listen to what we tell you. Remember, this is the tweet that I just talked about. I'm deeply concerned by the spread of coronavirus in Iran and the public health risk to the Iranian people and our neighbors. The U.S. offers our humanitarian assistance, right? Yeah, I'm sure you do. And in the meantime, you'll send in a bunch of people to overthrow the country. Yay! But we just talked about this, right? I mean, this is what you're getting from the mainstream media, right? They are putting out discussions of this guy right there and saying that he's talking about coronavirus and arguing that they don't need to do anything and just, pray and you'll be fine. The same things that I argue you could easily hear from evangelicals in this country, right? But let's not talk about that. But the point is, that man's been dead for 11 years. Doesn't change the fact that they're using him to pretend like their ideology is getting in the way of their fight for coronavirus, ignoring the sanctions or stopping everything as well. Oh, that doesn't count. But he's been dead for 11 years, and they're still pretending that he's doing that right now. That is mainstream media propaganda at its finest. It is always happening. Always, always, always. Such as how they argue Kim Jong-un killed somebody else and he shows up on the news 2 weeks later. Happens all the damn time. Now, another great article from Moon of Alabama. Coronavirus, it's time to press your government to react faster. Oh, dang it. Dang it. I just did that to myself. I had a spot in here that I had highlighted that I just lost. Anyway, we'll look through it real quick. So, the New York Times abuses the coronavirus pandemic to push more of its anti-China propaganda, which, I think all of them are right now. Now, it says, when a cluster of pneumonia cases of unknown origin appeared in Wuhan, its first reaction was, of course, confusion, not an immediate large-scale response. Yes, China could have been a bit faster, and some local administrations made mistakes, but who, please, if not Chinese government, has been leading the fight? Now, you could argue the discussion point, but the argument is we're seeing a decline. So the numbers say. And that's what he's saying. Then obviously the argument again is that other people around the world didn't respond fast enough. Now it says it's not a hoax for the government workers who cared for these for the people, right? Again, this is taking it that what they're saying is true, and it's always hard to take these things at face value. Dang it! I'm sorry. There was definitely something in here that I thought was relevant. Oh, well. I'm just going to move past it because I don't want to skim through this. Always removing my stuff for me when I have it highlighted for you guys. Oh, well. Well, all these are in the show notes for you guys. I mean, every single thing I have included in here is absolutely relevant for you to read. I can guarantee you it has something to do with the fact that there's not enough reaction time and they're not doing what they're supposed to. All right, and this is what all these are about. Same thing here. Don't test, don't tell. And this is the alarming part about this, right? And I can promise you that's the same thing that was over there. I'm building these points for you guys, and I just didn't want to read the whole article for you, but it's in there, trust me. And this just like this point. Now it says he wants to highlight a couple of quotes from this email. Now this is an email that was released. This is from Ben Hunt at epsilontheory.com. Now he says last night he received a Twitter DM that included screenshots of an email that went out to staff members at UC Davis Medical Center. Now, he says he wants to highlight a couple of quotes from the email. It says, since the patient did not fit the existing CDC criteria, the test was not immediately administered. UC Davis Health does not control the test process. Now, this is exactly what she was talking about on the organic prepper, right? This is UC Davis, the same thing. There's somebody that doesn't fit the criteria, so they're letting this person go. Even though they're showing the symptoms, they're showing signs, everything, people are concerned, but the CDC is ultimately saying no. It says the facts are pretty clear. Patient comes in from another hospital on Wednesday. This is 1 week ago. Already intubated and on a ventilator. And the doctors at UC Davis, who have treated other COVID-19 cases, immediately suspect COVID-19. But the CDC refuses to test. That is very weird. Really odd, especially coming from the very group who ultimately could be held accountable for not stopping this, right? Sort of like FEMA in the middle of some kind of natural disaster. This could come back, and it will. But the question is this because they're being incompetent or because they know something we don't? And they said, why, right? Because it didn't fit their criteria for testing. They didn't know for sure that the patient was in mainland China within the past 14 days, which, by the way, 14 days, right? Because I thought it was 20-something now. They didn't know for sure that the patient was in close contact with another confirmed case. I understand it's highlighted. They might be. They just don't know for sure. So by definition, this patient can't possibly have coronavirus. No test for you. This is don't test, don't tell, and is a single most incompetent, corrupt public health policy of my lifetime. It's happening all over the country. Right? Why is that not important? Why is this not a cover-up of sorts? Is this not an effort to downplay what's going on? Is this not malfeasance, or not malfeasance, but incompetence, ineptitude? And, this is dangerous. So they're pointing at Iran, saying they're not doing what they're supposed to based on nothing but assumptions. Here's that staring us in the face. Our own government clearly not doing what they're supposed to. Take it for what you will. I don't think that this is the kind of thing that cannot be ignored. Now, meanwhile, talking about the sanctions and the fact that they're actively hurting Iran in the process of this, and just in a general sense, it's very frustrating that we can have people in Congress who are suddenly, somehow just completely okay with sanctions murdering families and starving people to death all around the world, keeping heating oil from people, starving them in Venezuela. All around the world, these sanctions are actively hurting people. They don't care about it, not a single bit. But the moment it can be used for a political purpose, here comes Elizabeth Warren to claim that sanctions are causing problems. Iran has the most coronavirus deaths outside of China, although U.S. sanctions exempt humanitarian items, which is so not very true, by the way. Right? This is so incredibly false. Why? Because it's actively done in the backhand to stop these companies from doing so. This is the exact reason that they created the Swiss channel. They wouldn't need to create the Swiss channel so many weeks ago if this stuff was getting through, right? That's very clearly not the case. They created the Swiss channel to argue that they needed something to get the medicine through. And then it still didn't work because people are too afraid that the U.S. sanctions regime is going to come after them, because it will, by the way, because that's the unspoken disagreement, is they know that the U.S. will be malicious about it. They'll attack you just like they attack Iranian people trying to go to college in the U.S., just like they attack my PayPal account for somebody mentioning Iran when they give a donation. Does that affect the government of Iran? Obviously not. They will always go down and attack the individual to make a statement. They don't want your company helping Iran people. We're going to attack you if you do. But publicly, we're going to pretend like everything gets through, and that's exemptions made. It's a lie. She knows it's a lie. They all know it's a lie. So she's a liar. Okay? But this is the point, that she's using this for a political purpose. Although U.S. sanctions exempt humanitarian items, I'm concerned that in practice, sanctions may... God, that's so incredibly false and so incredibly disingenuous. Right? Again, understand, they all know that it's not getting through. That's why they made the Swiss channel. So she's somehow concerned that in practice, sanctions may be limiting access to basic medical supply, exactly like they are, because we've already addressed it. Her is what I'm speaking as. And it says, to help the Iranian people, I want info from this, blah, blah, blah. Right? This is purely politically motivated. No one's going to do anything about this. No one's going to even respond to this. This is simply done so she can make herself look like the good guy. Because they're not going to change anything, because the sanctions are doing what they're meant to do. Specifically stop them from getting medical treatment because they want to hurt them, like they're designed to do. It's offensive. It's disgusting that people like this can use the suffering of humans to politically benefit. Now, as Caitlin Johnstone writes, sanctions like coronavirus kill the weakest and most vulnerable of the targeted population. The U.S. is like if coronavirus was a country, which I love the point. I think it's hilarious. The problem is it's not true, right? It's not true. We just showed you this. The bottom line is it does not affect the most vulnerable. Only half of them. In fact, the most vulnerable, the infants, are apparently not affected at all. 0 mortality rate. So as she was just trying to make a comical point about what we're dealing with, it's not true. The most vulnerable among us are not, in fact, completely focused on, right? And here's the tweet she was mentioning from Max Blumenthal. U.S. sanctions have prevented Iran from buying coronavirus test kits, which is true, allowing the disease to spread unhindered, which, I don't know if I agree with. Sanctions are doing what they're designed to do, kill. That's correct. Right? I think this is in a way kind of bolstering the narrative point. Iran is maintaining that's not what's happening. So for him to say that is kind of, in a weird backhanded way, saying Iran's lying, saying that it is happening and they're not saying the truth. I don't agree with that. I don't think we have the evidence to suggest that yet. The death rate is ridiculous. And I think that speaks to something a little more nefarious than not having thermometers and test kits. That's my opinion. Nonetheless, the point is the same. U.S. sanctions have prevented Iran from buying test kits and other medical equipment that they need. Sanctions are doing what they're designed to do. Kill. 100%. Now, Iran is blasting the United States government for offering help, as Pompeo, in just obvious disingenuous fashion, said right here. We'll help them if need. Like, as their sanctions are hurting people, as their sanctions right now are starving people, as they're actively attacking this country in every possible way, which is actively affecting the people in this country, and they pretend they're fighting for those people, he's saying, well, we'll offer assistance to those Iranian people to get their needs met. The needs like the medical equipment that your sanctions are stopping, right? So this is like, starving someone to death and then coming in with food and saying, we're here to help. Here's some food for you that we've been keeping from you. I mean, that's just disgusting, because these people are disgusting. And it is a political, psychological game, right? This is absolutely what it is. Just like this is what they've outlined. The psychological game, just like they outlined in the Project for a New American Century document, Rebuilding America's Defenses, right? Just like they outlined in Which Path to Persia, the psychological game that they've documented they planned to play against Iran, right? It's not very secret. That's why it blows my mind that these things are just public knowledge. They just pretend that it's just coincidence, that every single thing we documented years ago is actually happening right now. Just coincidence, right? It's a joke. Obviously, they're after Iran. Obviously, they're trying to overthrow Iran for the second time. Obviously, they're going to do anything they can to attack them. Anything they can use. And when I mean anything, I mean anything. Anything they can use to throw at them. Any lies, any manipulations, any false flags, they will use to attack Iran. That is a simple fact.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition. Of, you know, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
And maybe they did, right? Maybe those other means are exactly what we're looking at. Maybe they could step up. You know, we're in the game of psychological, you know, this is what we're talking about. Right? It's things like that. These documented points of where they're actually outlining exactly what's happening today. I don't know how we can continue to ignore these things. Now, a few more things to end off with here today. Just things that bother me. Seriously, people, stop buying masks, according to this is just literally according to the U.S. Surgeon General. Their own account, right? How in the world does this U.S. Surgeon General have $600,000? I think that's fake. Seriously, people, stop buying masks. They are not effective in preventing general public from catching coronavirus, they say. But if healthcare providers can't get them to care for sick patients, it puts them and our communities at risk. Really? I mean, there's two things about this that bother me a lot. One, you're running out of, so you're telling me that this is the very group, whether it's the CDC or even just the U.S. Surgeon General, the World Health Organization, these are the people that are supposed to be prepared for global pandemics. And we have something that's happening right now that's not even close to what they're supposed to theorize, right? They theorized 65 million people dead 6 weeks before this happened. So you're telling me that these groups can theorize the catastrophic world-ending pandemic, and they cannot fathom that people would buy face masks in the midst of a problem. Oh, we're running out everywhere. Everybody stop. This seems crazy stupid to me. This either shows you an overwhelming incompetence or that this is artificially created. Again, as always, it's probably kind of both, but the point is it's just stupid to me. I feel like the fact that this, and then the second part is that you're telling people not to buy masks so your healthcare workers can wear masks. Even though you just said that they're not effective against corona, I get that it's about other problems they're dealing with. But so then you're also telling me that these hospitals don't also have stocks of their own. I mean, everything about this doesn't make sense to me. This seems, again, either these people are not prepared for exactly what they're supposed to be prepared for, or this is just some kind of artificially created fear-mongering tactic. Bottom line, this just bothers me in every possible way. And I think we're being lied to, guys. I really do. Now, again, I'm not, this obviously took longer than I wanted it to today, so I'm probably not going to do the Pompeo and Syria discussion tonight, but I will do that. I'm going to do that first thing tomorrow morning, and I'll probably have that up early tomorrow. I might even just record it and put it up for you, but I am dying to go through this entire hearing with Pompeo because it's choice. It's exactly what I want to. I want to watch these people call him out on his lies, and it's great because I would trust me. It's not just Pompeo. I'd feel this way about any government official that gets run through, that gets put out there on display, and they just rattle off these things like, "What about this lie? What about this lie? How do you address this? What do you think about that?" Apparently, they even put up on a map. Like, remember the discussion about Pompeo when he was in the room with that journalist and he supposedly pulled out a map and was like, "Why don't you point to Ukraine for me?" And like, trying to be really dismissive and act like she doesn't know what she's talking about. And apparently she pointed to the Ukraine. He argues she didn't. I mean, it was just stupid nonsense. Apparently Congress literally pulled up a map, a blank map, and said, "Pompeo, can you point for us out where the embassy that was an imminent threat from Soleimani on that map?" It's just things like that, which are just, that's crazy. And I want to talk about that, but I will be doing that tomorrow. The reason I'm saying that now is because I'm going to end with these last two parts. I needed to play this clip for you. This is a clip from this same hearing, mind you. There was a lot of very powerful stuff in there, which is why, but again, it's like 2.5 hours long. So it's going to be like a 4-hour video to break this whole thing down. But this is crazy. There was a few questions about the coronavirus because it's in regard to Iran, the coronavirus. It kind of came up in this discussion specifically for Pompeo. And this is him being directly asked, is this a hoax? Is this a hoax? Is the coronavirus a hoax? And not only would Pompeo he did everything he could to not answer the question. Why would that be? He's trying to play like it's a gotcha question, but it's obviously just a basic question because this is a discussion that people are having. Even Trump is the one alluding that this is not real. And suddenly he refuses to answer. I don't know about you, but this seems very suspicious to me.
Do you agree with Donald Trump's chief of staff, Mulvaney, that the coronavirus is the hoax of the...
Seems a little low. Let me know if that's high for you in the chat, or loud enough, I should say.
Agree with Donald Trump's chief... do you agree with Donald Trump's chief of staff, Mulvaney, that the coronavirus is the hoax of the day?
The State Department is doing everything it can to protect American citizens around the world.
Sorry.
Hoax of the day.
The State Department is doing everything it can to protect American citizens around the world.
Do you believe coronavirus is the
I'm not
hoax
going
of
to
the
comment
day?
on what others say.
I'm just asking you, do you believe the coronavirus is a hoax?
I'm just telling you what the Secretary of State's doing.
Do you believe the coronavirus is a hoax?
We're working to keep people safe.
You can't even answer that question?
Yeah,
it's not even a gotcha question. You believe the coronavirus is a hoax?
It's a gotcha moment. It's not useful.
Is the coronavirus a hoax? Can you just answer that question?
We're taking it seriously. This is
are you
serious.
At 12:15 today? Are you in fact yourself speaking at CPAC at 12:15 today? Are you speaking?
Yes, I am. I'm planning.
All right. So you can only give 2 hours. This bipartisan group of members of Congress, and instead of answering questions on life and death issues from a bipartisan group of America's representatives, you're going to go talk to a special interest group.
Yes.
You, sir, represent all Americans, not a special interest group. It is shameful. You can't even answer basic questions. I yield back.
Boom. Now, for real, expect about 4 hours of that. Right. And that I know a lot of you are interested to see that as well. And again, it's not just about Pompeo. Right. I mean, it's just simply about accountability. It's so frustrating that we're at a point where I keep having to turn that around so you guys can hear it. We're at a point where these people are just completely unaccountable to the point to where it's physically you can see him. It's physically angering to him. Like, he can't stand the fact that he has to answer these questions and the fact that he has to get put on the spot. People, the guy's a liar. I mean, he's lying about everything we're talking about here, and even members of Congress are calling him out. Now, clearly, for most of them, it's a left-right career move. Nonetheless, that aligns with the truth at that moment, just like I'm always pointing out. But he will not talk about it. Understand, he was subpoenaed to come, and he refused. I argue that he only went because Trump probably made him go, but I don't think he would have gone. And he refused to answer the question. He just simply would not answer it. And as he points out, Lou, I think he's going to speak at a special interest meeting, or, rather specifically for not the American people kind of thing, but special interests, the CPAC, the conservative meeting, and giving them limited time. So really, special interests are more important than the American people. That's the point. But of course, we know that's exactly how our politics in this country operate across the board. It's unnerving. But as I said, I know many of you would like to see that now, but trust me, it's late for me here. It'll take too long, but I'll get to that tomorrow, and we will go through that tomorrow, as well as everything with Syria and everything going on there, because there's a lot more information. But to end today, everyone's talking about the masks and everything, and the discussions the masks don't work, and maybe they do. Regardless of what the Surgeon General says, if you think it makes you feel better, go get them. It's their fault that they're not prepared, not yours. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, quarantine, all of these things, there's only so much you can do, because people are people, and they're always going to be the kind of, there's always going to be those people out there that just either don't care or aren't smart enough to understand what they're doing. And everywhere you go, people exactly like this guy, just casually drinking right out of the ladle, one of those nice, Whole Foods soup bars, as this guy says, wear all the masks you want, folks. Just to end with some humor, there are people like that everywhere you go. And, a mask and things like, there's only so much you can really do. When you go out in the public, there are always going to be risks, no matter what you do. So the point is, regardless of what you think about this, regardless of whether you think it's a bioweapon or 5G, or it's all fake, or it's way worse than it is, just show discernment. Be skeptical, be safe, take precautions, go out and get some water and some food. And, because the point is, as James and many people are pointing out, including Star in the chat, is the fact that, the way people act, the way people respond because of the fear-mongering of the people trying to pretend they're fighting for you, the mainstream and the governments, that people will respond in dangerous ways, even if it's not real, right? That's important to think about. So I'm not trying to cause more panic. I think we should be lessening that panic. Nonetheless, people will respond the way they do, especially the mindless mainstream media watchers. So take precautions, be safe, but recognize that we don't know the full story. So it's time to start asking questions. It's time to start demanding answers. Thank you for being here today, and I hope this gave some more information for people out there looking for more, just across the board, not to just get one person telling you they know the truth, but rather to understand all the nuanced information. And if you really want more on that, I hope you'll actually take the time to go through each one of these articles. Go through and read James's article all the way through. Go through and read John Rappaport's article all the way through. Watch Spiro's video from start to finish. That is the best way for you to understand this, not just to understand what I think is happening, right? Think for yourself. That's what they're afraid of the most. I love you guys. Thank you for being here. As always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
It seems as if the president at least twice has backed down from directly confronting Iran in the last few months. Does it worry you that at the last moment he'll back away?
But suffice it to say, building up defensive presence and sanctions are not the limit of what the Trump administration will do?
Oh, goodness, no.
What was that? There will be a briefing. No briefing. Anyway, welcome to the State Department. I think we have some interns in the back. Welcome. Good to see you in this exercise in transparency and democracy.
Now, I know that standards have slipped over the last few years in Washington, but for a lawyer, you're remarkably cavalier with any idea of justice.